This week on the show, we're going to be talking to FreeBSD developer and former core team member John Baldwin about a variety of topics, including running a DevSummit, everything you pretty much needed or wanted to know about that. That's all coming up right now on BSDNow, the place to be, SD. Episode 125, DevSummits Core and the Baldwin, recorded January 20th, 2016. Hey, I'm your host, Chris Moore.
And I'm Alan Jude.
Glad to have you guys with us this week. We got another exciting episode. It's kind of cool. We've done so many live episodes in a row. We haven't been out of town for any shows, but something tells me that's going to change in the next... let's see, what do we have, a month and a half till Tokyo? I think that's like the first one where we'll be going.
Well, the interesting thing is it just so happens the next two conferences I go to happen where I like leave on a Thursday or something and get back on like a Tuesday, and means I won't actually miss a Wednesday.
Oh, okay. Well, that's good. Good deal then.
Yeah,
so I guess Tokyo will be the first one where we give you a pre-recorded one. So we'll make sure we have an awesome interview or something for that. It should be good. But we still got a little while before we get to that. So there's going to be lots of stuff to do, lots of work happening, and exciting changes happening in BSD.
Yes.
So I guess we should jump right into the headlines here. So first up, this was an article we saw make the rounds a little bit earlier this week. But we've heard stories about this kind of thing before. You know, that box that kind of sits in the corner, underappreciated, but just refuses to die, right? Well, the UK Register has picked up on a story of a FreeBSD server that's finally being retired after almost 19 years of dedicated service.
That's a lot.
Which, that is a lot. So we have a couple interesting quotes here from this, but... the article says, in its day, it was a reasonable machine, a 200 megahertz Pentium, of course, a whopping 32 megs of RAM, 4 gigabyte SCSI 2 drive, Ross writes, and until recently, it was doing its job fine. Of late, however, the hard drive had finally started throwing errors, and it was time to retire it before it gave up the ghost. The drive's a Seagate for those of you looking to avoid drives that can't deliver more than 19 years of error-free operation. Well, that's a good power tip there. We appreciate it.
Yeah, I usually only expect like 15 years of uninterrupted operation out of my hard drive, so I think I'll stick with my Seagates.
There you go. But interestingly enough, not only was the system sitting in the corner, but it looks like it wasn't even updated. This system in particular had been running FreeBSD 2.2.1 this whole time, which, wow, why not upgrade though, you ask? Well, Ross, who was interviewed in the article, has an answer for that. He says it was a heavily firewalled and only very specific services were visible to anyone, and most only visible to our directly connected customers. Ross told Vulture South, by the time it was probably due for a review, things had moved so far that all the original code was so tightly bound to the operating system itself that later versions of the OS would have and ultimately did require a substantial rework. While it was running and not showing any signs of stress, it was simply expedient to let sleeping dogs lie. So, I wonder how many other systems there are out there like this.
Yeah.
You know what, Alan? I think we need to issue a challenge. If any of our listeners have a box like that that's been chugging in the corner for years or more than decades,
I don't have
let us know.
Something quite like that. But the machine, the first batch of machines we bought when we started Scale Engine in 2008, one of them, Bravo, has been running continuously since the day we bought it. It got rebooted once, and that's when the OS got upgraded as well, when it had to move from one data center to another data center that was like 75 kilometers away. It got powered down, got some more RAM, another hard drive, and an OS upgrade. But since the day we moved into that newer data center, it has been on continuously. It currently has an uptime of 1,867 days and 17 hours.
Well, it is rocking.
Yes.
Well, of course, the Register, I love the headline. They say servers retired after 18 years and 10 months. Beat that, readers.
Yes.
Well, if anybody out there can beat that, we would love to hear it. And we'll, of course, share that on BSDNow with everyone. And we can, point the Register at that and tell them, hey, somebody beat it. But that is pretty darn impressive. And I guess 2.2.1, wow. That's I've never even played with FreeBSD that old. I don't know. Did you ever, Alan?
None at all. I can understand why you wouldn't upgrade at some point, just because you'd have to physically get a different box because,
Sure.
a 32 megs of RAM isn't going to run a modern FreeBSD kernel so well.
Not very generous
Yeah.
anymore.
But I love that they point out that, when they built it to last a long time, including using large 24-volt case fans with better bearings than you get in normal computer fans, but then running them off the 12-volt rail and keeping them going. Plenty of air, but staying quiet and, designed for longer industrial type applications than, the cheap little fans you are attached to things, but you would normally use for a computer, right?
Yep. Well, I think he says too, it was kept in a nice environment.
Yes.
He said temperature was around 18 centigrade and very stable. So nicely conditioned power, no vibration. So, I mean, those are all the right conditions you want for server longevity.
Well, even just for desktops and stuff, I hear about people losing power supplies all the time. I'm like, I don't remember the last time I blew a power supply, but
I've lost
APCs, right? Yeah, but you put the APC between the power and the computer, and
Sure.
it definitely makes the power supply last longer.
Although a lot of mine were lost like in the first 3 months of their use. It's just crappy power supplies, the kind that come with the case.
Yes.
Logisys.
Yeah. I always
don't use those.
when I was building the computers myself, the supplier I used always had sparkle power, which is like, I really don't want my power supply to sparkle. That doesn't sound good at all.
Yeah.
But they were really, really good power supplies, and I've had a lot of luck with those.
We actually did have one burst into flames, which was quite interesting. I had never seen that on a power supply, but one of the Logisys we had got, again, it came with the case, right? Cheap system.
Well, what cases are you buying? Don't buy those kind.
Really cheap cases. They're kids' computers. I just go with cheap stuff.
I do remember the very first server I built when I was like 16 or 17 when I started doing IRC shell stuff. We bought the case off eBay, and it was like had a dent in it, and it just had really terrible airflow. That poor AMD Athlon 1700 plus just sat there burning up for years.
Well, I've since learned the error of my ways. I don't use any of those Logisys anymore. I spend the little extra, get the Corsair. It's just worth it in the hassle because I had too many. I think it was like a 40% failure rate is what I was running at the time. I had put in a bunch of these, and I was like, let's just switch to a different brand.
Yeah.
Even if the case comes with the power supply, I just toss it.
Yeah. It's like maybe keep it as a spare to use temporarily, but
that's right.
I want the power supply I picked.
That's right. So anyway, if anybody else has greater uptime than this system or knows of a system that's still running like that, let us know. We'd love to break that news on BSDNow. That would be really cool. Of course, you'd have to send pictures. I don't think there was any pictures of the system there. But you almost need the screenshot of the poor little, system sitting in the corner with, I guess, no dust in this case. They probably had it in a nice room. But
that was honestly when I had a machine that was at a data center and the CPU fan died. I basically replaced the machine and had the old one shipped back to me, and I was, fix it up and ship it to a local colo instead. And the biggest thing I noticed is after like years of operations, I got it at my house, crack it open, and there's no dust on the motherboard. By the end of the 2 weeks at my house being repaired, it was full of dust.
Yeah. I remember when we did some construction here, the same thing. I had to clean out all the computers like a couple times a month because there was so much drywall dust.
Yeah, this stuff's
getting
nasty.
inside. They're very bad for power supplies.
Yeah, or pets also.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, well, cool. Well, let's get into this next story here then, Alan. So we got another one here. It looks like Linux Voice. I believe that Linux Voice. I think that's a print magazine too, right?
Yeah, judging by the giant picture they have up at the top here. Yeah.
Yeah, so they recently did a group test of a variety of BSD distros, which I got to put the quotes around that so people don't get mad. But actually a really interesting review. They did quite a roundup here. They did FreeBSD, Open, NetBSD, DragonFly, GhostBSD, and PCBSD. So quite a cross-sampling there of different things. It's a pretty good, first of all, I'm always glad to see things like this hitting Linux magazines, right? BSD's getting more exposure. It's like they're waking up that, hey, there's these alternatives out there. But it is a pretty good overview of BSD in general. It starts off telling a little bit about the project's histories, where some of the forks came from that spawned from different things. And then they mention, of course, that a lot of stuff out there you've heard of is running FreeBSD, things like FreeNAS, Junos, PlayStation, pfSense, et cetera, et cetera. lots of stuff out there. But the review kind of goes through each of these different BSDs and then gives them a little bit of a, I don't know, I guess they give them a star rating at the end, you know. But they start with a look at OpenBSD, and the consensus they reach is that it's really good, but it requires a little bit more manual work to run as a desktop. And that's one thing I noticed. It didn't explicitly say it at the start of the review, but most of their review nitpicks focus on desktop usage. So bear in mind that's where they're coming from.
Well,
here.
it is a Linux magazine, which is kind of probably what it's focused on.
That's true. But they did end up giving OpenBSD a solid 4 out of 5 star rating, though, which pretty darn good. So next up, they went to Ghost BSD. They discussed it being a little bit of a live distro, which can optionally be installed to disk. They docked a couple points for lacking a graphical package management utility and some bugs they ran into during the installation, but still gave it a respectable 3 out of 5. And then next up, they actually gave DragonFly a spin, and they did mention and give it some praise for its very up-to-date video driver support, which we've covered in the news here for months now as those guys keep on rocking there. But they also talk a little bit about the Hammer file system and what that brings to the table. But they did give it 3 out of 5 stars, I guess, partially due to the reviewer having to use the command line for management, which, you know, a little bit of a trend here I'm noticing in the reviews. NetBSD came up next, and of course they gave it a special mention for being one of the only distros that doesn't do frequent releases. So they said, however, that doesn't mean you can't have updated packages, and they do mention both the availability of package source and PKG as being available, so you can, of course, roll and customize your desktop. And the reviewer in this case was a little bit haunted by having to edit files in Etsy by hand to do wireless. I'm probably thinking WPA supplicant by hand. But he did give NetBSD a 3 out of 5 overall. And then last but not least, they did kind of a little different head-to-head of FreeBSD and PCBSD. FreeBSD they went with first. They mentioned, of course, the text install is pretty straightforward, and most config is going to, of course, require being done by hand. However, the reviewer must be getting used to the command line at this point, because they do mention specifically that this may sound cumbersome, but it's actually pretty straightforward, and at the end produces a finely tuned aerodynamic system that does exactly what you want it to and nothing else, which is one of the strengths in my mind of FreeBSD. I've always liked that. Nothing gets turned on until I do so.
Yes, I'd love their little... So like FreeBSD is all do it yourself. Heck, you have to install the package management tool before you can use packages. It's like it has a bootstrap tool. The first time you try to use it, it installs itself. It's not hard, but yeah.
But yeah, they did mention that, like, the package system's not even installed out of box, but well, whatever. But ultimately, at the end, though, they gave PCBSD a lot of love, which is pretty nice. I guess in particular, they were focused on some of the various tools that were written to make PCBSD easier. Things like Life Preserver for doing backups, Warden for jail management, having a graphical installer, all that jazz. I will correct a slight mistake from the author, though. They mentioned in the article that Life Preserver does rsync backups to FreeNAS, and that's not accurate. We use ZFS replication for everything. So, but the concept's the same. We're doing backups to a FreeNAS box. So anyway, in the end, they end up giving FreeBSD a 4 out of 5 stars and PCBSD a 5 out of 5 for the roundup. So, hey, I'll take it.
Yeah.
That's good. Right? But, you know, some reviews obviously are going to be subjective, and in particular, they're looking at more of a desktop use case for the system. But still, it's nice to see BSD getting some good press and interest from the Linux community in general. So if you have Linux friends, or if you yourself are a Linux person, maybe give this review a read. There's a lot of interesting information here, which you can definitely pass along, and maybe it'll get you a little more BSD curious.
Also, just note that I guess it's just they base this slightly older versions of some of the OSs here. Like it's 10.1, not 10.2.
Yeah, that's true.
And
it was
so on.
A little bit outdated there, but
I'm not sure really
when
outdated,
the actual reviewer.
But yes.
Well, yeah, I'm not sure when he actually downloaded the ISOs and whatnot, but still, for the most part, I'm sure most of the facts are the same. Although they did mention DragonFly's updated, video support and stuff, so they must have checked that one out more recently.
I don't know. I guess DragonFly has always been slightly ahead.
Yeah. Okay. Well, cool.
Man.
Well, speaking of video stuff, we have Ted Ewingst, who we've had on the show before.
Yes.
Posted something really cool up on his site here, talking about a little planning ahead guide he put together for those thinking about new laptops for 2016 and looking ahead to, say, OpenBSD 5.9. So he starts off giving us a little bit of a status update on several of the key driver components that are going to be in 5.9 release. One of the things he mentions here, the quote is, 5.9 will be the first release to support graphics on the Broadwell CPUs. This is anything that looks like an i5 5000 something.
Yeah, or i3 or i7, etc.
Yep. Yeah. So he said there's a few minor quirks, but generally it works well. There's no support for the new Skylake models, however. They'll probably work with the Visa driver, but minus suspend, resume, and acceleration, just as 5.8 did with Broadwell. So he then goes on to mention, of course, that the IWM driver for a wireless is working pretty well with most of the revisions, 7260, 7265, and the 3160s that ship in most of the Broadwell-based laptops that are out there right now. However, he mentioned...
Go ahead.
Yeah. No, go ahead. No.
Oh, he's just mentioning that their IWN and IWM drivers now support 802.11n as well.
Yeah, they do. That's right. I wonder if that'll percolate over into FreeBSD's IWM. That would be kind of nice, because I noticed mine's a little slow on the X1. Anyway, but he says the newer Skylake series ship with the 8260, which is not yet supported, so keep that in mind. But then he goes on and lists some of the more common makes and models to start looking for, and he mentions first up that the Broadwell-based X1 carbons work really well, and of course I give them 2 thumbs up because that's what I'm using here and I really like it. He said, but of course make sure it's not the newer Skylake model just yet, so if you can get a hold of one now or soonish that's still Broadwell, I think you'll enjoy that. They are great little units. He does mention a MacBook, of course, but probably should be avoided due to crummy Broadcom Wi-Fi. Sorry, no support. And one I have never looked at, but he said the Dell XPS, I think the 15 he mentions is a good choice for kind of a powerful, portable, desktop-ish type laptop. So if you need more oomph in your laptop, that can be an option as well.
But again, watch that you don't get the newer Skylake models.
Yeah, correct.
It would be really nice if all the manufacturers did a good job of actually, separating the model numbers and not. So far, the Lenovo's been good because just like the processors have the series number, like the same, like the T530 is the Ivy Bridge and the T540 is Haswell and 550 is Broadwell, and it'll be like 560 for Skylake. But, all the vendors have been pretty bad for randomly changing things in different versions of the same model even. Almost all the Lenovo's can come with like one of 5 different Wi-Fi cards, 3 or 4 of which will work, and you end up getting one that doesn't.
The one that doesn't, right?
And things like that.
I wish they would put specific model numbers on everything, like this chipset. So I've had better luck, buying the components off things like Newegg, because usually they list specifically what hardware.
When I bought my Lenovo, I did a custom ordered one, and so I got to pick the components. It's like I'm specifically picking one with NVIDIA graphics and this known to work Intel IWN chip and so on.
But well, definitely looks like there's some neat systems out there now. I suppose if the Broadwells, you can still buy them brand new. It's not like you got to hit eBay for those right now.
Exactly.
So if you're looking at a new portable for this next year, maybe get on that soon. If you're going
to especially with the Skylakes just about to come out, a lot of them will probably be on sale as the stores try to get rid of all their Broadwell stuff before Skylake comes out. I don't know if you'll be better off trying to get it just before Skylake or just after, but
right when they really discount them.
But hopefully we can see that stuff landing in FreeBSD soon as well.
Well, I'm just hoping, as more and more of these dev summits we go to the BSD conferences, we like to see the trends shifting a little bit more away from MacBooks and more towards people running BSD. But that's a personal thing of mine.
Mine too.
Okay, well, next up we have some changes. It looks like some significant things are changing in a NetBSD land going from 7 to 8. So you want to tell us a little bit about those, Alan?
So they have this, I think, semi-automated website here that keeps track of all the changes since 7.0 to 8.0. And it's kind of like that old coming up next in the next head version of FreeBSD. But they basically have the date of each of the commits down to about the month level and basically show all the changes they've been making. So just some highlights here. NetBSD 8 will have GCC 4.8.5. They've imported DHCP CD and replaced RTSOL and RTSOL-D and all that stuff. So both, I guess, V4 and V6 will all be done with the DHCP client thing. They've got bind version 9.10.3. They've upgraded the get text. I don't know if that's there was a BSD licensed get text happening in NetBSD And judging by the version number being 0.16, I wonder if that's the same thing.
The new one. Oh, interesting. Okay.
I don't know.
So the DHCP,
Oh, no,
CD
that's regular GNU get text. Anyway.
is a mouthful. We've been looking at maybe using that for PCBSD as well.
Well,
Might be interesting.
NetBSD switched to it in their base system, so that's the thing.
Yeah, that's kind of cool.
They added the ISMT driver, which is another Intel chipset internal SMBus driver, which could be interesting. More LM temp and AMD temp stuff for getting temperature stuff out of CPUs.
Okay.
Their GPT utility, which I guess is kind of like Gpart on FreeBSD, it now has the ability to resize partitions and disks, as well as change the type of an existing partition. And they also got, like, helpful. I think they set and unset keywords for GPT flags and a couple other, basically rounding out that utility to have feature parity with FreeBSD. Obviously updating OpenSSH to the latest 7.1 and OpenSSL to 101Q. Their FTP client, which, like the one on OpenBSD, also does HTTP, whereas on FreeBSD we have the separate fetch utility. Now has SNI support for HTTPS. So when it does the SSL handshake, it includes the host name it's trying to connect to. So a server can have multiple certificates on the same IP address and send the right matching certificate. So
it'll do the right thing now.
Yeah. So your client won't complain about the SSL certificate if the thing you're trying to download from has multiple SSL certificates, because the client will now send which host name you want so that you can get the matching certificate instead of not.
That's nice.
They've also imported dtrace from FreeBSD and updated their copy of that, including syscall support and lockstat support for dtrace. Okay. So much improved dtrace will be quite interesting on NetBSD as well.
Do they have a estimated timetable for when 8.0 is supposed to drop?
I don't know, but it's been brewing for a while. So obviously this is like their head branch, so you can use it now, but I don't know when the next release will be.
Nice. Well, we'll have to keep an eye on that for you guys. Of course, we'll let you know when that finally does drop.
And of course, on this page, they go all the way back through. You can trace back to 3D6 BSD 0.1 plus PatchKit 0.2.2 up to NetBSD version 0.8. And then to 09 to 1.0 all the way up to 1.6, and then 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.
Nice. Okay. Well, so that's all the major headlines for the week. Of course, we have an awesome interview coming up with John Baldwin here in a moment. But before we get to that, we do want to mention the first sponsor this week, which is going to be DigitalOcean, and the website for that, DigitalOcean.com. Did we verify? Did you get an email back about that coupon code?
No, but nobody else has complained, so I think it still works.
I think it still works. So FreeBSDNow. So if you have an account and you haven't already redeemed one of their $10 credits, you can use the FreeBSDNow coupon code to give yourself a $10 credit for DigitalOcean, which is good for basically running 2 months of a VM there.
Yes.
One of the lower end ones.
Yeah. Well, depending on what you're doing on it, it's actually not that low end.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm using mine. It works fine for everything I need to do on it.
I have a mail server one and separately a status website one.
Nice. Yeah, we do some stuff with Mumble and also have a mail server backup. So that works well. But again, guys, DigitalOcean.com, of course, they have FreeBSD droplets available. There are ways to install OpenBSD as well.
And NetBSD.
And Net as well. So it's pretty neat. And since they give you pretty much a nice HTML5 commander to do everything with, it makes it pretty darn easy to do.
Yeah, like you actually get console access, basically via an HTML5 interface. So in a pinch, you can even do it from your phone. Right down to basically, it's a VM, so there's not BIOS level access, but it's basically the same thing. So you can, no matter what you do to your VM, you can always fix it.
That's right. So check it out today, folks. And if you talk to anybody over at DigitalOcean, let them know you heard about it here on BSDNow.
And you also have snapshots, so you can undo anything bad that you happen to do to your VM.
That's right.
Lots of locations, including a speed test website, so that they can, so that you can use the speed test to decide which location will be best for you to put your VM if you're worried about performance to a specific place.
We're joined now by John Baldwin of FreeBSD development fame. So first of all, thank you so much for coming on the show today. We appreciate you taking the time, John.
No problem.
So the question we ask everyone, since this is your first time on the show with us, tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, I guess your story that led you into BSD.
Oh my goodness. So I first started using FreeBSD as a freshman in college. I actually went to a school that was using FreeBSD as their Unix on the desktop because it was still the mid 90s. Um, and they forestalled switching to Linux until after I graduated, I guess is the way to put it. But I got hooked on FreeBSD.
You left and it all went to pot. That was it, right?
It was part of the contention when I was leaving, actually. Anyway,
Okay.
I started, I guess, with 217, and I didn't use that for much of anything. And then I used 222 to build a little a router in my dorm. So I was in the oldest set of dorms on campus, and we didn't have 10BASE-T. So we had these kind of janky phones that you would connect a serial cable to, and you could kind of manually dial up and then run WinSock or the equivalent to run PPP to get a dial-up connection. And so everybody who shared a room had this, everybody had this dance where anytime you want to connect to the internet, you'd unplug your roommate, you plug your roommate in. And so I got some, what was old, ancient, crufty network gear even by those days, of some 10BASE-2, the little thin BNC, and ran my own little LAN in my dorm room so my roommate and I can both be on the internet at the same time, which is innovation. And that my little router box was my first FreeBSD, my real FreeBSD box. And I knew I kind of always wanted, I wanted to hack on the level bits. I've got my brain is broken in the right way to where that's what I want to work on. I really don't care if it looks pretty. Like I'm not going to do these philosophical debates about what HCI component to use. I would be useless in that. But I want to know how the bits and the guts work. So I always kind of wanted to get to the point of hacking on a low-level bits. In fact, in high school, I had a very good friend of mine who was kind of my mentor for helping me to go beyond BASIC to Pascal and even assemblings and stuff like that. And for a while, we had this project where we wanted to write a really cool BBS that would be multi-threaded, and it was going to use all the things in the 386 processor, like tasks and so forth. And in fact, then it got to the point, well, to have this cool BBS, we need to write an operating system because DOS wasn't going to cut it. And to that, we're going to have to write compiler, all sorts of stuff. And we got to the point of I had a rough sketch of the layout for a file system that was mostly like UFS. We never got any actual real code, but even in high school, I was dreaming of hacking on my own OS, as bizarre as that is. But as I was using FreeBSD in college, that was what I loved to use. I insisted on doing all my homework on that. I was running beta versions of the JDK when it was first ported to FreeBSD because my college used Java instead of C++ for OOP. And so I was the only one, I think, running all my class assignments for my Java class on a FreeBSD box in the test lab there, or the undergraduate lab. And by my senior year in college, when I first got my commit bit, as a documentation committer, that's the only commit bit I ever actually formally received, was to work on docs. We can see how well that turned out. And after college, I had the chance to, what I thought to me was a dream job. I got to go out to California to work for Walnut Creek CD-ROM to basically be one of 4 or 5 people they were hiring to hack on FreeBSD. And I basically have to thank Mike Smith for deciding that I was one of the people to pick to do that. I was supposed to work on IS-64. And that also did not work out well. But I ended up on nights on IRC starting to hack on SMP. And that's how I started doing more kernel hacking rather than boot code and documentation. And it kind of has gone from there.
Snowballed. Cool.
Yeah, it sounds a little bit like my story nowadays. Is I started with documentation and got into the boot code.
The boot code's pretty snarly.
It is. It was a special experience.
Yes.
I wrote all about it for Age of BSDCon.
So what? We can relive your pain, Alan? Thanks.
Well,
Thanks.
you can laugh at my pain, basically.
We can laugh at your misery.
Yeah, that's how I tried to structure the paper. Trying to balance between an academic paper and having you laugh at me was challenging. But anyway. So I guess you mentioned a couple of things like SMP and so on, but what are some of the things in FreeBSD that we can blame you for?
It's a bit of a list, I guess. Mostly in x86 land, although I did, one of the things I did with SMP was try to tease. We got a drop of code from BSDOS, which is how our SMP effort in FreeBSD started. And one of the things I did early on was to try to make it less x86 specific, or at that time i386 specific, so that we could add alpha. I had some patches from Doug Rapson to get SMP working on alpha, but I ended up kind of finishing that and actually having SMP be machine independent early on. So aside from that, though, most of my work has been in x86 land. A lot of the interrupt stuff, and dealing with PCI interrupts and the mess that is. ACPI, PCI bits, various. It just depends on various things, I guess, and what different employers have wanted over the time. I've recently, for fun, if you can call it fun, I've been hacking on GDB quite a bit. It really depends on just different areas of the system. I don't.
Whatever's broken.
Sure.
Yeah, kind of. Whatever piques my interest. I hacked on Trust this year, which I'd never done before. Again, related to GDB and ptrace and process debugging and stuff. But it's kind of varies. I wander in different places and break all sorts of things.
So if you did ACPI work, do you know why my laptop doesn't suspend resume, by any chance?
Usually, well, for most laptops, it actually resumes fine. It just doesn't turn the LCD panel back on most of the time.
Oh, okay.
And then that's why the KMS driver is important, because they can actually turn the LCD panel back on Intel ones, and similar for Radeon and whatnot. In the older days, like I had a Dell laptop. My first laptop was a Dell laptop I got at Wanacreek CD-ROM. That one, its BIOS would turn the LCD back on for you, so it would resume fine, but then it would panic an ATA driver. Nowadays, the ATA driver is much better and it will actually resume just fine. But you get a laptop and the screen doesn't turn back. But normally the machine will actually resume fine. It is at some small esoteric, well, it's not very esoteric. On a laptop, it really matters is turning the LCD back on. That's usually the biggest issue. Usually most laptops will actually resume in the terms of all the devices come back on. The OS is running, you just can't see any up.
Interesting.
Yeah,
Okay, I'm going to have to check into that and see if that's
see if you can still SSH into it when it resumes.
It's useful to do that, right?
Right.
I mean, if you have if your wireless will come back, which it should nowadays, usually, then you can SSH into the darn thing. But it's still not. I mean, a laptop, you want to use the screen,
right? But
non-start. And the other problem too is the KMS is tied into this, right? You need GPU to work. You also want X to not be a sucky experience, which means you need your GPU to actually have a native driver and not be usable. So to have a usable laptop, solving that problem also should help with making suspend and resume usable. I use a ThinkPad X220 currently from my FreeBSD laptop, and since the KMS driver went into head, having suspend and resume work has actually been very nice. I can oftentimes now just survive not using my Mac. I am using it for run Skype at the moment, but and I like having both laptops. But I actually am very happy to hack on my FreeBSD laptop, especially for development. It's much nicer to run Beehive to do VMs. I can compile natively on the host instead of having to do all my compiles inside the VM. You can run KGB on the host directly against the VM, which is kind of nice. So when I'm actually hacking on FreeBSD, I much prefer doing it on my FreeBSD laptop or my FreeBSD desktop. And I really use my Mac to run Firefox.
Right.
Yeah.
And
I know.
while doing it. So.
Yeah, I've switched over. They have those new Lenovo X1 Carbons, so those guys have been pretty nice. But yeah, no native video drivers, still suffering a little with SCFB. But hey, it's doable. It's workable. Just no suspend resume yet.
Yeah,
one thing at a time.
With newer KMS, you will get resume.
Yeah, it's gonna be great.
I have two X220s for playing with, partly because originally the boot code didn't work properly on them, although that turned out to not be a boot code problem. And then I have a
problem.
Yeah, it was a BIOS problem, but I managed to find a workaround, adapt somebody's workaround into a way that a regular person could use it.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. But my X220 is still running with NBR instead of GPT because no one had really figured out exactly what was broken in their BIOS. That is something else you can kind of blame me for, actually, is the non-EFI GPT bootstrap. I wrote that for Yahoo so we could boot on larger RAID volumes.
Yes.
Because NBR can't do bigger than 2 to the 32 LBAs, which is 2 terabytes, or something along those lines.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and luckily I got Colin to help me update your code a little bit so it could load more than 64K of bootloader.
Yes, well, because normally you don't need more than that.
Well, no, until I started playing with it, it was like 16K. And
well, part of the idea is that hopefully most of the logic will be in loader, not in the early things like GPT boot and so forth. You'd like those things to not change often because they're a PIDA to update. And so don't have the fallback. With loader, you have loader.old. So if you close the thing you're hacking on all the time, usually you have a fallback. When it's the boot blocks that are like DD'd into some random partition in your disk, you don't have the fallback. So you'd like those things to not change as often and to be more stable, but which also means reducing the scope of what they do, constraining their functionality to avoid making it something that's fragile. Anyway, that's my thought on the bootstrap.
Oh, hey, you want to review Alan's patch for that? Hey, his patch is pretty useful. You know, Geli support in the bootloader is pretty darn good.
No, that's useful. And honestly, we should be able. I mean, I wrote the GPT bootstrap so that we didn't have the 14.5K problem or 15.5K that you do with UFS, which is insane. I wanted this to be bigger so it could do like 500K. Just had a simple logic bug that prevented it from doing more than that. But like, for example, we should be able to unify GPT boot and GPT ZFS boot. And if you have to deal with the fact that most systems are only going to have UFS or ZFS, so you can just pick the one you find, and that will just work for 99.9%. If someone is insane enough to want both of those on a system, then they've got to figure. Then we'll just have to provide a mechanism for them to configure which one they want to do. But that's kind of, I mean, if you're that nuts, then okay, you're going to put both of those on the same disk, no less. Like not, you know, that same disk. That's kind of odd. Especially with ZFS boot environments and things, that's just not really a use case that's going to happen. So a merged one of those would be nice, because it's kind of silly to have all 8 different bootloaders for all the different permutations and combinations. We should cut those down when possible. And the GPT one was designed so that you could have a generic thing to find the loader for different file systems and only have one of those.
Yeah, I looked at that, but there was just enough differences that I didn't want to go down that rabbit hole just yet. But I think that's that might be a project I will do.
It would be nice to do. There are some, and EFI presents some nice opportunities. Some of the things we have to do with hacks to do things like picking which partition to boot and next boot and things like those, which are kind of hacky because, for example, in UFS, you have to write to the file system and from the bootloader to overwrite the nextboot.conf. That's kind of gross. EFI, with the variables it'll store in NVRAM for you, is a much nicer interface. So eventually we'll get to do replacing some of those features, or the GPT boot me and things like that. Trying to do those things with firmware variables when possible is a much nicer interface. So that'll be nice.
The one that PJD and I were talking about was for NanoBSD. They do the thing with 2 UFS partitions and then a GPT flag to say which one to boot. And then when you do an update and it can boot the other one or whatever, to avoid the next boot, trying to write to the read-only image problem. But how to do that for ZFS. Maybe actually having a second pool property called like altbootfs, and then if a flag is set on the partition, use that one instead of the bootfs, so that on an appliance that has boot environments, it can automatically fail over to the second boot environment if the first one fails to boot properly. Or something like that.
But I think when you have EFI available, I think that's even better because you can avoid modifying the disk.
Right.
Especially with ZFS, that gets more fun, right? Because if you modify it, UFS, when you overwrite nextboot.conf, you're just overwriting in place. You can't do that with ZFS.
Right.
I'm not sure if pool properties are different.
Well, so this one, you wouldn't, the bootloader would never try to write to them. It would just be using a GPT flag to tell it which of the 2 properties that's already there to use.
You're writing to the GPT.
Yeah. Yes.
So you just write it to the disk.
Yeah. But at least you're not trying to.
But you're not writing to ZFS, which would be a total disaster.
Yeah. In the boot code, the path to write to ZFS is an empty function with just panic.
Yeah.
Right.
As it should be.
Only UFS supports writing.
Yeah.
And only for the next boot. So I use next boot not to switch between partitions or between boot environments like you would with BADM. I use it to run test kernels because I want my default kernel in the system to still be the stock kernel so that if it blows up, it falls back to something sane. So I always install my test kernels to like boot test usually, or boot foobar or something else, and then next boot -k test or foobar or whatever, which works really well on UFS. And it does work on ZFS, except that if the kernel panics before mounting, it actually keeps staying on that same kernel forever. So it kind of really doesn't work.
Right, because
it works if your kernels don't. If your kernels can make it to multi-user, it works. Most of mine do. But doing that in EFI would be even much nicer because then it would work reliably all the time. So.
Yeah. So recently you've been working on an updated version of GDB and KGDB. Could you tell us a little bit about what KGDB does and what your work's been going?
Oh, sure. So, I mean, KGDB is GDB that is useful on the kernel. I mean, the kernel is an ELF file, so you can use GDB on a kernel to do some things, to like examine symbols from a built kernel and so forth. But the kernel is a bit different from a user-led process. It's got some different properties. And KGDBs are usually, it's mostly just a couple of set of extra targets or bits of targets inside of GDB itself that know how to talk to a FreeBSD kernel. There are a couple of things that kernels do differently. One is that kernels don't have shared libraries, but they do have kernel modules. So there's a little target in KGDB that knows how to enumerate the loaded modules inside a kernel and treat them as, to GDB it looks like it's actually shared libraries, and then it can automatically load symbols for the shared libraries and so forth. Another case is that in GDB, in userland, if you get an exception or a fault, you get a signal, and you get a signal frame. And GDB kind of knows how to deal with signal frames in userland. In the kernel, you don't get a signal frame, you actually get a trap. And you get a special kind of frame, it's called a trap frame, directly on the kernel stack. And so you have to know how to unwind across a trap frame and how to handle that. And so part of that's for every architecture inside of KGDB is how to unwind across the trap frame and recognize the trap frame. Also on you might have some other magic frames. For example, on x86, when you had a double fault because you've exhausted your kernel stack, we actually switched to a different stack. And so knowing how to unwind across that so you can find out why, what you're recursing in infinitely that probably exhausted your stack, that's a different kind of frame unwinder that is in KGDB. And enumerating threads is different. You have to walk the list of processes and the threads inside each process. And so we actually present every kernel thread that is associated with the user thread, or even if it's not associated with user thread, because we have some threads in the kernel that are only kernel processes. But enumerating all of those as threads in GDB so you can switch between them, get backtraces, and register context and stuff of all the different threads inside the kernel. So being able to enumerate those threads is another one. And then being able to talk to libkvm to actually work on a crash dump. And the interface it provides to read and write arbitrary kernel memory. And so that's most of what KGDB is. Some of the changes I've done recently have also been to libkvm. The GDB in the base system is built kind of dumb, and then we hard-coded to only build for the native target. But GDB actually is a debugger that supports cross-debugging. And so the GDB imports actually will do cross-debugging. And whatever architectures are currently supported, it will then compile them all in. And so one of the things that changed in libkvm this year was refactoring libkvm to support all the different crash dump formats for the different platforms all at the same time. Previously, it only compiled in whatever was native for the current platform. And one of the things libkvm has to do is actually handle either walking page tables, or in the case of mini dumps, we actually kind of dump a limited pseudo set of page tables, so that when you want to look up a kernel address in a crash dump, you have to go find what offset in the file actually holds that memory. And you actually have to do kind of kernel virtual address to a physical address translation, and then you actually use the ELF headers in the core file. Or it can be ELF headers, not in a mini dump. In a mini dump, it's different. But you have to do some step to take a kernel virtual address, translate it to a physical address, and then translate that to an offset in the file. And those are different per architecture. And the new libkvm compiles all the backends for the different architectures directly so that it can speak to any arbitrary crash dump, which means that on the new KGDB, you can debug a crash dump from a different architecture. Right now, you can only do x86 because I haven't ported the new KGDB up to other platforms with working crash dumps. PowerPC is there, but it doesn't generate crash dumps at the moment. But in theory, I've done it on NBS64 and i386. But in theory, once KGB grows support for ARM and MIPS and so forth in the port, then you'll be able to take a crash dump from an ARM board like on a Pi and pull it on an x86 box to debug it, which would be a much nicer experience.
Yeah,
Sure.
where you have all your tools on your laptop.
Yeah, for real.
Where you have tools and where they run a little bit quicker.
Yeah, and you have memory and disk.
Yes, memory and disks and things and all sorts of nice conveniences. So that's actually more a libkvm project. Once I had fixed libkvm to have all these backends, the changes to KGDB were very small. But that is one of the things that the newer KGDB supports, I guess.
Okay. Nice. Well, how much of a limiting factor are you running into not being able to import, say, newer versions of GPL code?
So that's an interesting,
Or is it not even being a problem at all?
that is a so that's a there's a larger question there, and I was going to talk about it anyway, so we can go from here.
Okay.
I would I would not be surprised if people would ask, well, why are you hacking on GDB at all? We have this new LDB, and that's the bee's knees. Um, when I first started using FreeBSD, especially back in the late '90s, I really was attracted to the BSD license. I like users having freedom to make stupid choices sometimes, but still having the freedom to do so. That's kind of where my leanings fall. That I would rather I want people to have choices, and if they make bad choices, so be it. But I think that's better if people are able to have more choices open to them. At the time, so I really like the BSD license. At the time, having a fully BSD licensed system just seemed insurmountable because of the whole toolchain. It seemed like you could do a lot of bits, but that GCC was the big elephant in the room. There was never going to be a viable alternative to it. So, yeah, you could go do some small things, but why bother porting some small use on utilities when you still have the big monster in the room? And the whole thing with LLVM and Clang recently, that's been really exciting. It is finally feasible. I don't know if we're quite going to make it for 11.0, but we're definitely far along the path of having systems that are completely BSD licensed. And I think that's a great thing. 10 years ago, I wouldn't have thought it was possible if you asked me. I really didn't think it was going to happen. So I welcome this with open arms. At the same time, I think it's important that our users have a choice between both sets of tool chains. I think GCC is still very useful. In previous places I've worked, in some workloads, GCC is just going to work better than Clang. It's just true that we're not going to do that. And I think it's good for the ecosystem in general for there to be multiple viable tool chains, because I think they both help each other. The competition between them spurs them to get better.
Sure.
So I think having both viable is good. And I want both to be viable in FreeBSD. I think when possible that FreeBSD should ship something out of the box that is not GPLv3. But for example, on some of our less popular platforms where there isn't really mature Clang support, there's not really another viable option. Currently, we've tried to stick with GCC 4.2, but that is really holding us back and being really painful. And it's causing quite a divergence. And it's not just, I know people like to pick on Spark 64, which I have some fondness for, but it's not really that. You have other architectures. ARM on Clang isn't really all the way there yet. And MIPS less so, at least in mainline Clang. And then you have brand new architectures like RISC-V that's coming into the tree. There's that Clang and LVM are not really there at all for RISC-V, for example. We're going to need to be able to support both tool chains in the long term, I think. At least have it as an option. Now, when it comes to GDB, I think it's fine for GDB to be maintained as a port. It's kind of a little nutty. I'm doing most of my work on GDB and Git, which works fine, modulo working with Git. And I kind of have branches in Git for how I manage like the KGDB patches relative to the port and so forth. But then it's kind of odd. Like I pushed some fixes to KGDB the other day, and instead of being able to commit them to head like I normally would, I have to go post a PR and have the port maintainer look at it and okay that these patches for KGDB, which is really a very FreeBSD specific thing, are okay, so I can put them in and I have to bump port revision at the same time, and you don't quite get the same granularity of commit logs because you're batching up 4 or 5 changes into one port revision bump because you don't want to bump port revision 8 times in a day. It's kind of not as nice as when you have the tool and tree. But I think for GDB, that's just going to be kind of how it works. I've been talking to Core recently, and we're still working through the process of finding a good storing solution for folks who want to use a GPLv3 toolchain on FreeBSD, how that's going to work and what that will look like, and especially for platforms that don't have Clang, how we're going to cope with that. So that's still in progress, and I want it because I want users to have, excuse me, the choice. It's not that I love GPLv3, believe me, but I think the choice is important, and I think that Clang alone would limit FreeBSD's use cases too much. There's more out there in the world we need to be open to. Sure. I would be very happy if vendors would start shipping, binary Clang toolchains instead of binary GCC toolchains. But I think on the side of pragmatism, we currently have to be a little bit more realistic. and GCC 4.2 is not helping us. That we've got to ditch that. The old GDB and base, those things are just too old, too crufty. The only really viable tool chains are modern Clang and modern GCC going forward.
So maybe something like a FreeBSD-Toolchain ARM64 or something as a port that brings in all the stuff, and then the infrastructure and base knows where to find that and use it, kind of thing.
What I'm currently advocating is not really doing it all in ports and packages. That makes it hard, again, to maintain local packages. Even if we wanted to do it in ports and packages, you would need to do something to actually do a better job of maintaining the local patches. Like what I do with KGDB is pretty suboptimal, like I said, about having to check it in. If I didn't have my Git branch, it would really be a disaster of how I maintain changes and track changes over time. One of the things that having tighter integration between a GPLv3 toolchain and the base system is we could explore things I think are harder to do in ports. It would be really nice, for example, maybe the Clang front-end bits or the code generation bits aren't there, but maybe you can use libcompiler RT and libcsx RT and so forth, even with GCC 5 on, say, PowerPC or some MIPS variant or something like that, or RISC-V, so that you can have maybe your runtime is actually all BSD licenses, just that your toolchain to generate the bits aren't. And it's much easier to play with that and get that to work. You also can, depending on how you arrange it, we need to be able to track the facts that be able to track different branches and different releases like we do in base SVN. So your toolchain, your GPLv3 toolchain for head might be different than the one in stable 10 or stable 11, different releases and so forth. Being able to have that full support is much harder to do in a ports LAN where there's kind of all one thing.
Yeah.
And you have to have all this logic and OS version checks. It's just a lot harder to manage than if you do it in a version control system directly. So what I'm pushing, what we are currently going back and forth on is some variant of having a way, not by default, but a way to opt into having a toolchain in the base.
So something kind of like the CDL directory we have, where you can turn all the CDDL code off, except for GPL, but off by default?
More elegant than that.
You have to go to more links to opt in. We really don't want to ship GPLv3 bits in the default base. Certainly on systems where Clang works fine, we don't want to do that. So something that's sort of like that, but even more disconnected.
Right. So all the bits are there, but you have to choose to use them.
It's still in flux. We're still discussing this and figuring out what we think will work best. So nothing's really committed yet. But we also want to ship systems that work where GCC is the only valid toolchain. They really need a compiler out of the box.
And one that's not so old.
Would packaging base tie into this at some point, where it could just be package add base GCC or whatever? And
possibly. There was also a recent thread that packaging base may not make it for 11.0.
Yeah, don't run.
Kind of if we want to kick out GCC 4.2 for 11.0, that kind of makes that hard to achieve.
Sure.
I think that, I still think it's really useful to have the toolchain, the compiler at least in the base, to be able to bootstrap yourself. I recently, when I've been running PowerPC 64 for testing KGDB and some other things, and queuing on my laptop, you can't package install anything.
Yeah.
So you've got to be able to cope with that. And we can maybe do a lot of special case hacks to try to figure out ways to build only the compiler packages for certain platforms. But I'm inclined to think that having it actually be part of the base still is actually simpler, and simpler for managing releases and simpler for managing other things.
And that's kind of been the philosophy of FreeBSD for a long time, is that it's when you get the base system, it's everything you need.
And I'm being dragged a bit more kicking and screaming to the splitting up base system thing. So whatever we do, but I'll be dragged kicking and screaming along with it myself. So.
Cool. And
I don't want to kick and scream too much, but I'm not going to push it. I'm going to let it happen. Kind of.
So can you tell us a little bit about the work you've done on Beehive?
Sadly, only little bits on Beehive, not as much as I would like to have done. I have more things I would like to work on for Beehive.
Well, you can tell us about those too.
Well, those are more pie in the sky.
That's okay.
Most of the things I did were just little fixes to make it work better for me when I was doing development. With such as things as kind of hooking up enough of ACPI so you had equivalent of powering off the box with a signal, which I found useful. Part of when I dealt with PCI interrupts, I kind of knew, and all the different stuff you have to deal with when you want to be able to route PCI interrupts and so forth. I had seen lots of biases do that wrong. It was kind of neat to work on to have the chance to work on one to try to make it do the right thing. So that's part of why, even though nobody cares about legacy interrupts, that's part of why I sat down and made non-MSA interrupts work for PCI devices in Beehive, the emulated ones. Made all the ACPI tables generated correct, the MP tables generated correct, got some of the other ACPI bits more correct. I've just seen it be wrong. It was nice to be on the other side and do one that wasn't quite as wrong, and do one that should do the right thing. I'm trying to think of what was user visible more so than, I think ACPI power off was the one that most people would actually find useful and care about.
Sure.
I can't remember what else might be useful. Oh, I did make it so that when you suspend and resume your laptop, because I run Beehive on my X220, it doesn't panic. In fact,
that's good.
And your VMs actually work fine. We don't do any kind of notification to the VMs to tell them that they've suspended resume, which would be nice. Not yet. I guess one of the things I might like to do at some point, suspend and resume is overloaded term in virtualization. I would like to work on not kind of traditional suspend a VM and migrate it off to somewhere else, yada yada, and run it, but actually emulating what ACPI would call suspend and resume, like S1 and S3 in Beehive, which should be pretty simple. And then be able to wire up another virtual power button. It would be the term signal, maybe it's kill user 1 or user 2 or something, to give you like a suspend button so you can suspend a VM. This would be nice. Perhaps when suspending a laptop, you could suspend all the VMs with a kill all minus user 1 Beehive or something, and kill all user 1 to wake them back up when you resume. That wouldn't be too terrible of a thing. The other thing I would like to do is actually to emulate S4, which is Hibernate in Beehive, because I think that would give you a nice place to hack on Hibernate for FreeBSD.
Yeah, good testing platform.
Exactly, a good way to test. It's always nice to break a VM because you don't really care. If it's my VMs, if I need to rebuild it from scratch, there's no actual data I care about on it. But you can look at the disk, you can futz with it, you can single step, which would be nice. I guess another thing for Beehive is I would like to write a GDB target or a GDB server target, kind of like QEMU has, so that you can connect GDB directly to Beehive, and what you get is the raw CPU state and registers, and then bits in KGDB to talk to that. But we look a lot like QEMU. So, for example, when hacking on the boot code, you can boot up QEMU and you can single step to your boot code. That's a lot more convenient than when you're trying to actually boot it on bare metal and you
just get a triple fault from your laptop and it just reboots.
Or you have a jump halt and you just move it around until when it hangs versus it resets to try to find out where you've messed up something. It's a lot easier when you can actually step in the debugger and examine registers and so forth. So something like that for Beehive would be very nice, I think. And would also help with debugging things like startup or resume and so forth. And then the other pie in the sky thing for Beehive that I've talked a bit with Peter and Neil about is some sort of way for doing an efficient, transparent file system with zero copy and so forth. But that's a much bigger item to work on.
That one sounds like a lot more fun, though.
It would be different. It would be a lot of work. So.
Yep. Okay, well, we'll shift gears a little bit because we know you've run a lot of dev summits in the past. So tell us a bit about what's involved and what do you have to do to get all that organized?
Well, I'm actually a little behind on getting stuff ready for this year's dev summit. Well, I guess I've done it for several years now. I think 2009 was the first, so I should back up more. I first went to a conference when I was out of college for about a month. I had just gone to Walnut Creek CD-ROM. In June, we went down to Usenix ATC, which was in San Diego in 2000, and that was a fun conference to be at. It was before the bust, so the money was still flowing liberally. But it was a lot of fun to meet folks. I got to meet Peter Wim. We talked about PAE and other stuff in the terminal room when it was still a terminal room. Getting to meet other FreeBSD developers, and I found my experience, I guess the biggest takeaway I took from that conference was the talks and tracks are good, yes, but being out in the hallway and actually meeting with developers and stuff was really useful. So the next Usenix we had in 2001 in Boston, Robert helped me. We got Unix to give us a room for a couple of hours on a day, and we had our first kind of dev summit. We called it a summit even. We only had about 5 or 6 people there. But Dylan was there, and Doug Rapps and some other folks, and we talked about S&P stuff and had some debates about S&P stuff. But that was kind of the first Dev Summit. It was something I wanted and kind of asked for, and then Robert helped organize a lot of it. Fast forward several years later, I hadn't really run any of the Dev Summits, except from prodding to kind of get that first one started. And Robert asked me to take over, I think in 2009 was the first one I did for BSD Xen. And at this point, the early years, there were some scars, some things to learn. Trying to get the food right and food people would like right. Organizing the finances better so that they're reliable and just so it works smoother. Getting registration to work well. Some of those things, the early years, it took a while to kind of learn some lessons and get some things down. But now there's kind of a pattern, I have a schedule. I know we're going to do this, this, and this. I think some of the challenges is we've yet to succeed in recording sessions and streaming them from the Dev Summit, which I think would be very useful. Part of the challenges are that the Dev Summit happens in Canada and Ottawa, and none of the folks who organize the Dev Summit really live all that close to Ottawa, or we have contacts in Ottawa to talk to folks. Dan is a huge help there. I mean, Dan is the only all the contacts we do have are through Dan, so that's immensely useful. But that makes it a little harder to explore new things sometimes, being far away from where the venue is and where vendors for certain services might be. But in terms of, aside from recording for, I guess, one of the things now is not let it fall into a rut. I'm trying to evaluate every year how it's going, how effective it's actually being. Different people want different things out of the Dev Summit too. This kind of came up on the list last year. I think a lot of folks want to go to the Dev Summit to hack code. I would like to go to the Dev Summit and hack code. I usually don't end up getting much of anything done at BSD in terms of hacking code, though. Most of the time for me and for many other folks, what's most productive is actually kind of planning things or talking things out, or really just the social thing of being around other developers. As much as it's a vacation from work and, I could go and sit down and I could go bang out some new feature, it seems that much more what happens at Dev Summits and at conferences is not banging out new features and writing a bunch of code per se, at least for FreeBSD's community. So it's not quite like a hackathon usually. And I think trying to I can't turn Wi-Fi off. My normal rule of doing things is to have Wi-Fi off, but that would break the recording. Trying to make sure that the Dev Summit is being useful to all sorts of different folks. That people are getting benefits of it, whether it's they want to do a hackathon and go coding for a bit. I guess what I'm trying to get to is we've had working groups for a while now. It was something we started a couple of years ago. And every year I feel like a little worried about, are these working groups, is it people just sitting around talking and nothing ever getting done? Are there ones that are productive? And it seems to be a mix. For example, 2 years ago, it seemed most of the working groups only used the first half of their slot, not the second. So I almost last year cut them down to be a quarter day instead of a half day, or we're going to cut a track out or something. And last year, all the working groups I went to used both halves of their slots like to the max. They were full. So it's different to know what works right. But having this desire to have it be fresh every year, to not be stale, to not fall into a rut, so that folks are energized and ready to do something. I think that's, to me, at this point, the part that's hardest. And having done it for so many years, I'm a little worried that I'm used to this certain pattern that I'm not have the fresh eyes to see new things to do or new ways to organize it. And the other thing that's come up is most likely I will not be able to go next year due to a personal conflict, because my family takes priority over you guys. The only Unix conference I missed back in the 2000s was my oldest daughter was being born, and I called into the Dev Summit from the sidewalk outside the hospital to talk about S&P.
Right.
The reason for missing next year's BSD Xen will be something similar because she'll be graduating from junior high. So I am kind of looking for someone to help and I'll figure it out. But I'm going to need someone else to kind of help drive it next year because I won't be there in 2017. But I think also it would be nice to go to the conference and just go to the conference.
Yes.
Yeah.
Not too many things actually break at the Dev Summit, but it's just the stress of what if something broke, or making sure the food shows up, and it does show up, but you still stress it making sure the food shows up, and you want to make sure that the folks who requested a special meal get that special meal, and that people in the front of the line don't run down and grab the vegetarian food they didn't ask for, or you want to make sure that every room has all the AV set up and that people have gone to each room. You just have to run around, which means, for me, people want me to always be in the sessions. I'm like, well, I'd like to come to your session, but actually I have to go run around for the first 10 minutes at the start of all the sessions to make sure everything's working. So I can't come be but so active in your session. Part of me would love to just go to the conference and go to the conference.
Sure.
So maybe in a couple of years that'll be true. But at the same time of it being a lot of work, it is also very rewarding. It's stressful going up to it, but I'm glad when it's done. There's a lot of sense of relief, but I'm also glad that whatever part of it worked well, whatever folks aren't able to talk to each other or build relationships or bonds, those things are really valuable. So whatever benefit it has, it's rewarding to look back and know that it's helped folks, or that it's helping the community in some fashion. That's part of why I really like recordings to work, because I think that would really expand its scope and allow more folks to connect with it, and have it be more useful to the broader community, not just the folks who managed to make it to Canada each year.
Yeah, and like you said, the additional complexity with the recording it is, unlike with a talk where it's mostly just one person talking, in a working group, it can be almost more of a roundtable thing, and it's like, how do we can't mic up every person. And
Well, but you need especially if you do video, that requires a pretty astute camera person, really. I mean, it's hard for a talk. Yeah, you can probably set a camera up in one place in the room and just kind of leave it there, and hope it doesn't, run out of tape or something during the time. But when it comes to a discussion, if you really want someone to be able to follow the video well, you want it to have someone actually doing the camera who knows what they're doing and doesn't do it jerky and move it all around crazy, and kind of smoothly follow the flow of the conversation around the room. And I think all those things probably cost a lot of money unless you just have really good volunteers. But as I said in an earlier email to the developers list, we were talking about this. Even a crappy recording is better than no recording. So I'll take whatever we can do in terms of getting recording stuff done. It just hasn't worked out in the past for whatever reasons. So I know some folks have stepped up and offered to volunteer this year, and I'm really hoping they will just take it on so I don't have to deal with it.
Yeah. I remember at Asia BSDCon like 2 years ago, I just stuck a little handheld audio recorder on the podium and recorded 2 hours of Matt Aarons explaining how ZFS works. It's like, that's great. We need that. Yeah.
I guess that was kind of the next question then.
Oh, well, the other one was at the OpenZFS Developer Summit, they had, one day kind of similar to our Dev Summit, but the second day they had more of the hackathon where it was, build a new prototype of something, and then they had, judged them at the end and had prizes. That could be interesting.
No, it could. I'm trying to think. I mean, no, it could.
Because
the other thing, I guess, is the BSD Can Dev Summit in particular has a lot of folks come to it who aren't necessarily kernel hackers who just want to hack. We actually have a lot of vendors come and stuff. And so you also want to make sure you
have something for them to do.
Well, something for everyone to do. You don't want to have dead space where folks feel like they come and it's a waste of time, or that there's not things that are relevant to what they're doing and what they're working on. And I think BSD Can in particular, although the Silicon Valley one now probably is a similar bent, has that focus. There's a strong vendor presence. And so adjusting the flow of how that DevSummit works compared to, say, the one in Cambridge, which is much more kernel hacker heavy, that kind of plays part of the layout of why it's structured the way it is. But again, it might be actually quite sensible to do some very different things. So part of why I would be excited to have someone else take over, try out some different things and see how it goes.
Well, because the other thing, obviously, is if you try to do something for everyone, you end up where, well, I'd love to go do the hackathon thing, but there's this working group I need to be in. And it's like, having enough things for everybody and not getting to the point where everybody wants to be in all of them at once.
Well, I'll put that this way.
That's a good problem to have, though.
It's a bad conference that there's 3 tracks of talks and everybody just wants to go to one track.
Right.
It's a good track. It's a good conference if people are having to stress and worry about which of the great talks they go to, because stuff to fit.
Yeah, I agree. So we know you spent a little bit of time on Core. So tell us a little bit about that. What's it like exactly serving on Core? What does that involve?
Well, I mean, just dealing with people. I'm an engineer-ish. Well, I'm not an engineer. I do not have a certification. I did not go through the engineering school at my school, which was a lot tougher than CS, which was in the arts and sciences Wimpy College. So I'm not an engineer. But we know how computer geeks are, I guess. I know for me, I'd much rather hack on a computer because if it breaks, it's my fault, and I can kind of deal with things being my fault. Dealing with people is a lot more tricky. It's just a lot more complexity. And a big part of being on Core is actually dealing with a lot of the people side of things and trying to do that well and not badly. But I think the other really big thing, I don't know if I saw it the first 2 times I was on Core, but especially the last 2 times it stuck out to me. The project is a lot of stuff, and lots of people are working on lots of things, and that's great. And you kind of want to facilitate folks working on different things. But I would say that one of the biggest roles of Core is finding things that are not getting done because no one's either it's fallen through the cracks or someone who wants to work on them, but they're not connected with the right people or something. Looking for things falling through the cracks and helping those things move along and get finished to enable other people to do work. That's usually not fun because the things that are fun to do, people are already doing. So if you're going to pick up the cracks, things that fall in the cracks, you have to go find the things that probably aren't that fun to do, that no one else wants to do. That's what you got to go do. And if you're running for Core and you're not motivated to go do that, then you're running for the wrong job. The other thing about Core is one of the dirty secrets. Different folks on Core have different levels of participation or put in different amounts of time, which can be frustrating. I would encourage folks who want to run for Core to make sure they have time to devote to it and time to spend time doing things that are not fun, time to respond to different threads or questions, being around, being available, being an active participant. That's a key requirement in my mind of being on Core. That's something that's important to do, that you have to be willing to make a sacrifice, sort of. I mean, I'm not, we're not really making sacrifices in that it is a sacrifice in terms of sacrificing some of the stuff that I would like to do that's fun. It's not a sacrifice in that I'm like not eating food or something like that. Right. So I'm a little hesitant to use the word, but you have to be willing to put off doing some of the things you would like to do because you think some of these non-fun things are more important for the project to progress as a whole. But by its nature, that's also not fun to do. I guess that's a little bit of what it's like to be on Core, or some of my takeaways. It is certainly necessary. I do encourage folks to assume good intentions, not bad intentions by default from folks who are on Core. They're people just like the rest of us, and they're trying their hardest. It's when you're having to do some of this work and doing things behind the scenes and having to know some of the kind of dirty laundry you don't want to air publicly and then get yelled at by the people that you're kind of helping, that's not motivating, I would say. But it's not the worst job in the world, but it is some job that is less fun than just sitting down and hacking on code all day. And the people who do it deserve our appreciation.
Cool. So the next question was, if you had unlimited time to add any one thing to FreeBSD, what would it be? When we ask this question of ZFS, they call it the ZFS retirement community question.
The problem is my list is not one.
Right. Well, we have lots of time.
Ever-growing list of things to add to FreeBSD, and changes, as you get something done, then you knock it off the list.
Yeah.
I don't know that I really have one. There's several things I would like to do, and I try to work on the things that I think are important. Although then you get stuck in rabbit trails. I mean, I don't know how important trust really is, but it's been fun to work on. Although probably there are some other things I should work on instead, but be that what it may. I think having suspended disk work really well would be good, because that would bypass all the laptops that can't suspend and resume normally, because Hibernate does always work because you do a full power off and on, and the LCD panel is going to turn back on.
Yes.
You're going to go through post. But I haven't made any progress on that one. But that's one I think would be useful. But I don't know if it's the single most important thing I would work on if I just had infinite time and resources.
Yeah. Well, the problem is you kind of need some of those time and resources just to come up with a list of things you would work on if you actually had those time and resources.
Well, and I try to, I guess I'm a little more head down and fixing things as I see them. But there's lots of things to fix. There's lots of things to fix.
Cool. So the other question we have is, do you have any hobbies outside of open source? How do you keep from going stir crazy?
Well, I'm a dad, 3 kids, girl, boy, girl, and that keeps me pretty busy.
Yeah.
Especially my youngest 3-year-old is very active. She's like a little tornado, and lots of running around to keep up with. I do play acoustic guitar, although I'm not getting to play this quite as much in the last year or two. Not tremendously well, but I can manage. I like reading, but I also FreeBSD, I guess, is one of my hobbies as part of it. I've been extremely fortunate that my job has also been my hobby. I know that a lot of folks are not privileged to be able to do that, and I try to not take that for granted, especially to realize a lot of folks on FreeBSD who work on FreeBSD are not able to commit the same amount of time. This is part of why even though it's not quite all drudgery, this is part of why I feel it is almost incumbent on me to run for core, or to help in the past with things like RE and so forth, especially when I've been a full-time employee somewhere where a big part of my job description was, well, make FreeBSD work for such and such product, but you get to go hack on FreeBSD part of your time. I almost felt it like a moral obligation that I should help out with some of the kind of administrative side of things, because I know there are other folks who are doing this purely for volunteer, their volunteer time, I want them to be able to
do the fun stuff.
Do the fun stuff. So even though it's a hobby, it's also my work. So it is my hobby. I like to do that, but I do also when I'm home. I do hack on code some when I'm home, especially a little bit more now that more recently I work from home. But I actually try to make sure I turn the laptop off for the most part and go be dad. I think I don't always do the best job of it, but I think dad is more important than JHP, the committer.
Right.
So I try to make that my priority where I spend my time, I guess.
And so the last question was there anything else you wanted to add before we let you go? We've taken up quite a bit of your time already.
No. I don't think so. Originally, I was maybe going to talk about the whole toolchain thing, but we kind of covered that earlier, so no need to get back into that enlightening discussion here. And I guess one of the things I would say is kind of what I was saying before. I really appreciate the chance to get to work on FreeBSD. I think it's really neat. I also really appreciate the community of people we have around us. There are lots of folks who are very nice. We have folks who, and at times folks can kind of be annoying or irritating, or impolite. But for the most part, folks in FreeBSD land, and I can't speak as much to other I think there are other communities that probably are better than us, probably similar to us. But for the most part, in my interactions with folks in FreeBSD land and in the FreeBSD community, we tend to get along fairly decently, and we tend to not be jerks to each other. And I have a lot of strong friendships and very good friends in FreeBSD. And I really appreciate that part of the community. And being a part of this community, to me, is a privilege the entire time. And I hope that in my actions, I don't take it for granted and that I kind of reflect that thankfulness correctly.
Well, I think that conferences are a big part of that, because actually meeting the people you're interacting with over the internet in person, it just helps. When you're reading their email, you hear it in their voice, and it sounds friendlier automatically than it might have as just a wall of text from the internet.
So I actually have one specific example of that I think is I am very fortunate to have that most folks don't. In Monterey in 2000, we had a BSDCon, and Bruce Evans flew up from Australia. And I got a chance to, and this is when I was still early days of hacking on SMP, and I was tearing up all sorts of things in the kernel and SMP land. I got a chance to, for a while, just sit and talk with Bruce. And I know many folks find Bruce's emails hard to read. Bruce is a very, very nice person. And I think, he's an older gentleman. And having met him and just spent some time with him has given me a whole different way of reading his emails. There's basically zero malice ever in a Bruce email. If anything, he's incredibly humble in my experience with him personally, and it helps to read. It helps knowing that to be able to read his emails more effectively. And yes, not everything he says is the gospel truth or what should be applied. But I do try hard to listen to Bruce. He knows a lot, and some of it is arcane details, but if you can really read and understand what he's writing and see what he's talking about, lots of times there's quite a few nuggets of truth in there. It's not to be written off easily. And I think people will get frustrated that, why don't you just commit your changes or push your stuff in or do stuff? And Bruce's character, I think, because he's kind of very humble and deferential, that's kind of why he doesn't work that way. And instead, he would like you to do things. And I guess I count some of my, if I had emails that I frame and put on the wall, some of them would be like these little thank you emails you get from Bruce, especially the ones that are unsolicited. Oh, thank you for fixing this, even though I didn't ask you to. I don't have many of those, but I have a few of those. Those would be something that I would maybe frame and put on the wall at some point, at least in the wall of my mind.
Right. Well, cool. Thank you. Well, thank you so much for spending the time with us today, John. We really appreciate it.
Oh, sure. My pleasure.
Yes.
And we're looking forward to seeing you at BSDCan. You going to go to Tokyo this year? Or?
That's not currently in the works. No, I'm definitely will be at BSDCan. Yes.
Okay.
I don't have any firm plans outside of that, but plans are always subject to change. So.
Sure. Okay. Well, we'll look forward to seeing you then. Looking forward to another great Dev Summit.
Oh, thank you. We'll try.
I'm sure it'll be fun.
Yes.
I've enjoyed all of them.
Well, after watching them organize a last-minute Dev Summit for FOSDEM, where until the last minute we were going to meet with laptops under a bridge, I think that you'd have to try pretty hard to have a bad Dev Summit. So.
Cool. Well, thanks again, John. We appreciate it. And we'll look forward to talking to you again someday in the future.
Okay. Thanks, guys.
Okay, I hope you guys enjoyed the interview today. Definitely fascinating, and we'll look forward to seeing John at next BSDCan. Okay, here. So news roundup. It's time to get into that. But before we do, we need to mention our other sponsor this week, which is going to be iXsystems. And of course, the website for that, iXsystems.com/BSDNow, is where you want to go to get yourself connected with those great guys over there. Talk to their sales engineers, let them figure out what exactly they can build for you to accomplish whatever the goal is you're trying to accomplish. So, Alan, have you ordered anything new recently?
Still pricing out stuff and looking at things, but because of a sale going on somewhere else, we might end up with rack space at a remote location pretty far away from Canada. But happens to actually be fairly close to IX. But what it means is, because it's a co-location, there's a fee for remote hands, right? They're like, well, when you first move in, we can help you out a little bit. We can do pretty much anything that doesn't require a screwdriver and so on. But basically, I'm going to have to ship servers to a place I've never been and where I will probably never go. And they have to kind of just work as soon as they get plugged in. And, there's only IX is the only people I trust to pre-configure the server exactly how I'm going to want it, so that it just shows up at the data center, gets plugged into the network, plugged into the power, and it's going to already know what its IP address should be, already be configured how I want it, and just come up and be ready to go. Because if it doesn't, then I'm stuck paying $150 an hour for some guy in another country to stand in front of the keyboard and read things to me on the phone, and me tell him what to type, and he type it wrong and it not work, and but just knowing that IX is going to set up the server for me the right way, they know what BSD is and they know what they're doing, is going to take a load off my mind. They
For sure.
when you place the order, you get this worksheet where you even specify how you want all the settings in the BIOS done, right? It's like, yes, I obviously want it to turn on immediately as soon as it gets power, but I want make sure by default the BIOS has the virtualization features turned off. Make sure those are turned on. Make sure that it's set this way and that way, and set up the management interface this way with not the default password, so that as soon as you get plugged in, it doesn't get rooted, and so on. And it just it's basically a very small touch, but it makes a very big difference. And it's the reason why I go with IX, because they do those couple of extra steps, on top of actually being cheaper than everybody else.
Sure.
But even if they weren't, it would be worth it because they actually know what they're doing. And,
that's right.
they treat you properly.
Okay. Well, great. So again, folks, that's going to be iXsystems.com/BSDNow. You'll want to go there, talk to their sales engineers, and if you order some crazy, weird, wild system, send us pictures of that or let us know, because we always love to hear about those.
Yes.
We get a kick out of that.
Hopefully you should know in the next couple of weeks if we're going ahead with the video transcoding servers, and then we can get some pictures of those. They probably won't be that exciting because it's basically a standard, it's like a standard E3, but the model number ends in a 5 instead of a 0, because that means it has a video card built into the CPU. So it won't really look special, but yes.
But it is. Every system from IX is special. Okay. Well, cool. Well, let's get into this news roundup, Alan. So I guess first up, you get some DragonFly news to tell us
Yes.
about.
So the DragonFly mail agent, also called DMA, is now available not only in DragonFly, but in D ports, FreeBSD ports, and package source on NetBSD.
Okay.
And because of package source, it also means it's available on Illumos and Linux and every other operating system. So
Sure.
DMA is a small mail transport agent designed for home and office use. It accepts mail from locally installed mail user agents, like your Thunderbird or command line stuff, or PHP script, whatever it is, and delivers the mail either locally or to a remote destination. Remote delivery includes several features like TLS and SSL support, SMTP authentication, etc. DMA is not intended as a replacement for big real MTAs like SendMail or Postfix or XIM. So consequently, DMA does not listen on port 25 for incoming connections. So it's just a small, simple mail agent that goes on your computer to be able to take email from your computer and send it out to the internet wherever it needs to go.
Somewhere else.
But doesn't end up, listening on port 25 and turning your computer into a server. So from a security perspective, it's much better, and it's definitely what 90% of people end up needing on their whatever BSD machine, right?
That seems like the kind of thing I'd rather almost have in base.
Well, Baptiste originally was looking at importing DMA into base to replace SendMail, since most of the time, if you're running anything, it's just so that that daily core or daily root email can go out, or your web server can send an email, your notification Nagios can send email. You don't really need SendMail, and especially don't want listening on port 25 in a jail where you're trying to lock things down or whatever. However, he hit some roadblocks. I don't remember what they were, but the fact that it's available in FreeBSD ports now probably means most of those have been solved.
Yeah, it's working well enough to be in ports. So I imagine it's just massaging the paths and whatnot to make it go into base. Somebody do that. That just sounds,
Baptiste is busy now, so somebody else can pick that up. I'm sure he'd be willing to share his notes on where he was stuck, so that can be worked around. And
yeah, I just like the idea of not having SendMail.
Or just not be on by default, or slowing down my boot by default.
I can live with it not being on by default for now, and then we'll talk about removing it later.
But yes, get that in as an option for now.
That would be cool. Okay. Well, next up, speaking of stuff landing in base, this is something we've been talking about off and on for a while. I'm very excited to see finally landed is the UEFI support for ZFS has been in. So this is, I guess, the patches we've been pulling into PCBSD for a few months now for current have finally all been fixed up and have been committed into FreeBSD base. And this was originally started by Eric.
Yeah, so he did the original patches on the mailing list and so on that you pulled in, and he got them into Fabricator. But I think he ran out of time to work on them. So Steve Hartland picked those up and pulled that into a Fabricator review and worked with people and got all the reviews and got it committed. And then as soon as he committed it, he coordinated with me. And just before he committed it, actually, Thomas Soom from the Illumos project, which has been porting the FreeBSD loader and EFI loader over to Illumos to replace Grub, he wrote the code to support all the like serial emulation stuff to actually draw the BSD menu. So now the EFI loader had the BSD menu. Then Steve hooked up the ZFS part. And so as soon as those two things were done, I was able to hook up the ZFS boot environment menu code by basically adding one line to the EFI loader and an extra function that creates the command or whatever. But the important stuff was the one line that inits it all. And so that's all in head now. I think there was a problem with the... So one of the things it did, this new code, was it modularized the existing code. So the old EFI loader basically just found the first UFS partition it could and then booted off of it. So in this new loader, what they did is they kind of pushed all the UFS stuff into one module and created a ZFS module. And the idea is that we could add a third one if we needed. But there might be a regression there that came up, I think, yesterday or the day before on ARM, maybe. I forget. Anyway, so I'm sure that'll get all worked out very soon, and that'll be great. And I'm looking at actually maybe redesigning the non-EFI bootloader stuff to work in a similar way. Well, not the loader so much as the boot 2 part before that, to work in the same way with kind of like module type things, or at least just an API where you can just specify which file system it is and have it work, because that would be really nice. So hopefully that can happen. And then the next step would be to hook up my Geli bootloader stuff, which is working now, into the EFI bits. So that's hopefully just a matter of that being that third module that we add as a different file system, and then it basically stacking between the disk and the UFS or ZFS module. So it basically tastes the disk. If it's Geli, then we call through Geli, which then once it decrypts it, looks at it and sees if it's UFS or ZFS, and calls the upper layer, or something to that effect. Or maybe it'll have to be done differently, but hopefully I'll have time to dig into that soon. And in 11, we will have all of the things.
I need that. That's what I want for my laptop, right? Because I like to do Jelly encryption on the disk.
ZFS and
ZFS
EFI to get the
EFI.
Because I've also heard on Skylake certain models, the CSM boot is really slow. Like takes like 8 minutes to boot, or something.
Holy crap! Really?
It's something in the very early BIOS emulation is just really slow and bad. I'm not sure why. So yeah, this means having EFI available to those people that have hardware that's acting strange would be good. Although separately, Thomas Soom also worked on improvements to the FreeBSD block cache for the loader bits that definitely speeds things up a lot. And I wonder if that getting into head might actually solve the problem those people are having with CSM as well. But very glad to see this all this stuff finally happening, and would like to see maybe even a little bit more intelligence added to the EFI stuff. The one that always got me with the really old EFI, I think it's been fixed now, was if I had the installer USB stick still plugged in my laptop, it would sometimes boot that instead of the hard drive, even if I used the BIOS boot selection menu to tell it which one to boot, and it would always boot the opposite. So if I asked for the installer, it would boot the disk, and if I asked for the disk, it would boot the installer, because it would just happened to be the first UFS partition it found.
Oh, that's annoying.
That doesn't seem to be an issue anymore, so I think that's addressed as well. And at some point it might come down to the fact it's like, oh, you have UFS and ZFS, or two UFSs, and maybe the loader could actually let you pick which one to boot from. Especially since with EFI we're not as space constrained anymore. You have this big fat partition. And
You could have
sticks
lots
in
of
there.
things
Yeah.
potentially.
Well, even with GPT, we got 500 kilobytes to work with instead of, on MBRs, like, well, you got 512 and then another 512 and then 15 and a half K. And that's it.
Yeah, not
Yeah.
a whole lot.
And even that 15K is actually stolen from the file system. Yeah.
So you know how I'm like really aggressive on like printing old stuff. Like we got rid of 32-bit support. Like I wonder when the day will come that we don't do MBR
I
anymore.
can't wait. After having played with that code,
It's scary to say it, but I'm like kind of excited.
Well, none of my Galley stuff works with MBR, and it's not possible to make it work with MBR. So
there's not enough space, right?
There's just literally
that was the same problem with Grub. There just was not room for the Jelly module.
So hopefully, with that Lenovo fix, I'm not aware of anybody's computer where GPT doesn't work properly. And if you have a computer where GPT doesn't work properly, please file a PR, and I will look at fixing it.
Yes, let us know. Let us know. I don't know, maybe like 11.2 or 12.0 will be when I finally kick that to the curb. I'm like, no more MBR. We hate MBR. So we'll see. Okay, well, that's great, Alan. Let us know when your patches are ready. I can't wait to try them out here. Okay, so next up, we have an article. It looks like Phoronix did a little bit of a benchmark here on 3BSDs compared to the 10 different Linux distros.
Yeah, so they've done the 10 different Linux distros a couple weeks ago, or I don't know, a while before today. And then so they did took those results and compared them up against Dragonfly BSD, OpenBSD, and PCBSD, and put out some benchmarks on that.
Which, of course, it's Phoronix, so we always take benchmarks with a little bit of a salt, right? I'm sure Brendan Gregg is screaming at his screen right now.
It's interesting. They do a breakdown of different Linuxes. It's like, they did Integros, which is Linux 4.3, GCC 5.3, and ext4. They did a CentOS 7, which is only Linux 3.10 and GCC 4.8, but has XFS. A clear Linux with ext4, Debian with ext4, and they also have in here, I thought somewhere in here they did a Linux with ZFS as well.
Okay.
And then they did.
Which one was it?
I don't see it.
Okay.
It's lost in my eyeball isn't finding it easily.
It's there somewhere.
Then they did Dragonfly with its GCC 5.2 and Hammer file system. OpenBSD 5.8 with GCC 4.2.1 and its default FFS. And PCBSD, which was FreeBSD 10.2 with Clang 4.2.1 and ZFS file system. And all of these were done, as with the 10 Linux distros, on the same Xeon E3 1231 V3 with 16 gigs of RAM and a 120 gigabyte Samsung 850 EVO SSD.
Sure.
So, server class hardware.
So how did we come out on the test?
It's kind of all over the place. For SQLite, PCBSD beat out every Linux by quite a bit. And for one reason or another, they couldn't get the test to run on Dragonfly or OpenBSD. I'm sure that's almost just their unfamiliarity with BSD and not a problem with either of those BSDs.
I don't know how to compile a tool or something.
But they said PCBSD's default ZFS file system was faster with its embedded SQ library than ext4 or ZFS-based Linux distros. It's like 17 seconds versus 25 to 35 seconds for Linux.
That's not bad. I'll take it.
On a compiler benchmark they did, PCBSD came in second behind only Clear Linux, which is Intel's Linux. That one has a much newer version of GCC, and I think might have been part of the reason for that. And then OpenBSD came in last, but again, I think that might just be its older version of GCC. And so while the benchmark looked like you're comparing these different versions of Linux, you are actually comparing various versions of the compiler.
Just comparing compiler versions, We've heard Brendan Gregg talk to us about that. You're just benchmarking your compiler, not necessarily
anything else.
The system.
Or just some extra settings. And the other interesting one is in a couple of these benchmarks, overlaid on the little progress bar that they're comparing, you see it's like, oh, well, on this Linux, we use this different set of flags. It's like, well, that's not comparing the same thing anymore. On another compile benchmark, PCBSD and OpenBSD were near the bottom with CentOS. Doesn't really explain why, which is, that's the first of the 5 whys you ask yourself when you're doing benchmarking. But for disk transaction performance, PCBSD again won out top of the list because of ZFS. And OpenBSD, because their older FFS lacks soft updates, that means those fsyncs are more work and require more seeking on the disk, so they were near the bottom. And DragonFly's HammerFS, again, was near the bottom as well. But I think that honestly has more to do with the fact that they're making sure when you do an fsync that your data is actually completely secure, whereas the Linuxes tend to cheat a little bit on that, risking your data to get better benchmark numbers, which, when you're asking for an fsync, you're actually more concerned about the safety of your data than the benchmark, right?
Sure.
That's the point.
Sure. That's why you issued it.
Going on for the some of the other tests they did, the Amino Science benchmark, PCBSD and DragonFly were right in the middle. Basically, mostly within pretty close to the margin of error. I think. If they ran the test a couple more times, the numbers might come out slightly differently. It's hard to say.
Sure.
But that was running GCC with -03 apparently. I don't know if they actually installed GCC on PCBSD or if they used Clang.
I don't know.
Then for the FLAC audio encoding, they had DragonFly in about the middle and PCBSD last, but they said that's known that Clang isn't as good at that particular workflow. So they were using Clang. It's like, well, you could, if you wanted to do a benchmark, you could install the same version of GCC that the Linuxes are using on PCBSD and try again. Or even just have 2 entries for PCBSD in that specific test to compare to the system compiler with the optional compiler. But, there's only so much you can do with benchmarks. And then with lame MP3 encoding, again, PCBSD was, 0.01 seconds behind a couple of Linuxes. And OpenBSD came out near the end, but apparently DragonFly failed to run the test. But again, I don't think that DragonFly is not able to run lame. I think it's just, the Fortnite benchmark suite doesn't get run on DragonFly very often. Sure. And then they did LZMA compression where PCBSD kept up with the Linuxes, but Open and DragonFly were down a little bit, but actually still faster than some Linuxes. And again, the difference here is a couple of seconds, so I don't know that it matters much. And then the other thing I pointed out is if you look at the standard error at the top option, the Linux that said was the fastest, its standard error there is 2 magnitudes larger than all the ones underneath it, which suggests it was only slightly faster one time or something, right? So it seems, again, these are just 4 Onyx benchmarks. But overall, it seems that PCBSD is either better or right in the middle of the pack. So,
yay.
Yeah,
I'll
exactly.
Oh, good deal. Thanks, Alan. Okay, so to round out the roundup, we have OpenSense has dropped a new release on us. It looks like, we're just barely into a new year, and they've already blessed us with another release. So in this new version, it looks like 15.7.24, there's a bunch of notable changes. They got some improvements specifically to the firewall UI, and the plugin management section of the firmware page has been added. Additionally, they've done some new and better signature verification using PKG's internal verification mechanisms. They've added that for, I guess, how they do their kernel and world updates, which is pretty cool. So I guess, does that mean they're packaging based then?
Well, I think it's because it's NanoBSD based. That's a little different than what we would normally consider packaging based. But yeah, because basically they have the 2 partitions, so you can just splat an image out, right? It's more of a firmware update than in that case. But it is nice to see them using the signing mechanism. Although I know that
nice.
Sebka at FreeBSD.org would love to do a much better signing system for the packages as soon as he gets time for that.
Okay. Well, they had also a full rundown of the changes. If you want to see all the actual commit logs, essentially, you can take a look at that on the release notes. But it looks like Suricata got an update, OpenVPN, NTP, and a bunch of other packages got bumped as well. So you'll want to update your OpenSense boxes as soon as you can and get all that new goodness.
Indeed.
Okay, so we got some Beastie Bits today. We got some feedback and questions, and we're going to get to all those in just a moment after we mention our last sponsor this week, which is going to be TarSnap. And of course, the URL for that, come on, you should know it by now, but tarsnap.com/BSDNow. I know it. I've had to talk about it a bunch, so I've remembered the URL.
Yes.
But it's pretty darn simple. There's no excuse for you not to remember that and go get set up. It'll take you just a couple minutes to get an account created. Look at the guide. If you're familiar with Tar, you're already 90% of the way there, so you kind of have an idea how you're going to do your backups. But TarSnap should be the way you're doing them, especially if you're not doing anything. First of all, if you're not doing anything, shame on you. You should be doing some
Your
kind of
files
backup
will disappear.
somewhere. It's just a matter of time. It's going to happen at some point. We don't know the certain day or time or the specifics of it, but hard drives fail, hardware fails, floods happen, earthquakes happen, stuff happens.
It's only $5. Create the account, back something up.
Done with
You'll thank me later.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So definitely go to tarsnap.com. And of course, since all the source is open, you can view it, you can audit it, you can make sure it's doing exactly what it promises. And because we're paranoid and you don't necessarily trust binaries built by other people, you can even download it yourself, compile it, and make sure you're running exactly what you think you're running. So come on, how many backup solutions out there do that? I mean, I wish more things were open source like this. I know, right? This is really kind of the gold standard model for how things should be done in the future. I mean, if you truly believe in things being open, being able to see what your code is doing, like TarSnap's leading the way. So definitely, if you've not tried them out, give them a shot today. Go get signed up. Put your few bucks in. You'll be shocked how long it lasts because it's so dirt cheap. There's no reason not to. And just get your backups done. Throw it in cron and then just watch your emails and make sure it's doing its thing and you're good to go. Anything else you want to add?
No, just admiring the new graphics on the website.
I know,
flowchart
right?
is fancy.
Okay, so we're going to hit the Beastie Bits now. So we only got a couple this week, but first up, it's a little bit older article.
We'll do BSD Can first.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
So
Dan mentioned BSD Can is still accepting.
Yes, so officially the call for papers ended on Tuesday, February 19th. But Dan is busy and hasn't actually flipped the switch, so you can't submit more talks. So if you forgot to get yours in by now, hurry up and get it in so that you can be giving a talk at BSD Can. Especially
take advantage of Dan's being really busy.
But especially if you're doing something new or sysadmin focused stuff. We had a whole cabal of us sysadmin type people that aren't developers being like, we need more sysadmin content at BSD Can. So we'd love to hear about that. You don't have to be a famous core developer or whatever to give a talk here. It's, this conference is for users as much as anybody else. And so if you do anything interesting at all, just propose it. The conference will pick which is the best talk. So it costs you nothing to write a couple of paragraphs and propose doing something.
Yeah, so definitely try and get that in. So don't wait because it might be too late. Dan may find a free moment and
flip that switch. So yes, get that done ASAP.
Get it done today. Okay, so first up, we have an article here on Beastie Bits, which is a little bit older, but I don't think we've covered it before. And it's quite possibly one of the most complete walkthroughs I've ever seen on setting up a desktop FreeBSD box from scratch. And I mean, like, it actually has a table of contents. There's that much stuff it discusses.
Yeah,
so
the table of contents is like 3 screenfuls.
Yeah, it's pretty darn complete. So granted, this isn't PCBSD, but and I think he mentions that in the article too. But it's because if you're do-it-yourselfer, I mean, you want to do it yourself. This is essentially, as I'm reading this, I'm like, oh, this is what we do in PCBSD because we do a lot of this.
Exactly.
For you, right?
This is the instructions to take a FreeBSD machine and get it to the point of what PCBSD gives you for free.
That's exactly right. So if you want to see all the hoops we jump through and the things that happen behind the scenes, this is your how-to. So actually a really great learning experience if you really want to learn a lot of FreeBSD administration and just really get your feet wet in a non-threatening environment because it's not a server, so you're not going to blow up something critical. this is a great way to do it. So definitely wanted to highlight that. That'll be in the show notes if you need the link. It's probably too long for you to remember if I read it off to you, but definitely check that out.
Yeah.
Okay,
And they
so
even
what's
have
going on? I guess scale.
all the instructions here to how to upgrade your system after, so that it's a little bit future-proof.
It is pretty good, and it has been updated several times. Not in the last year or so, but over the years it has been.
Yeah,
so
it's
maybe
got
a future update.
the ZFS support in the installer, so it's not that old.
Yeah. All right, so now are you doing scale this year? Or not,
No,
Alan?
because I'm going to FOSDEM and they were too close together.
Okay.
Plus, scale starts like tomorrow or something.
Yeah, that's right. It is pretty darn soon. That's right. I think Drew just left for it today or tomorrow.
Exactly.
But anyway, that is definitely happening. Well, it looks like it's Drew's. Yeah, Drew's speaking at scale. That's in Southern California, the Linux Expo out there, and it's a big one. I've been to it many years.
Yeah, recently for this year they had to move to a bigger venue because last year they couldn't fit everybody.
It was, gosh, what's it been? 3-4 years since I've gone to a scale, and it was huge then. Like, this is a big conference. So if you're in the Los Angeles area, which I'm sure we have at least a few listeners out in that area, see if you can get down to that. There's going to be a bunch of different BSD things there to do. So let me see here. I know iXsystems will have a booth, and Drew Levine will be
she's
there.
giving a talk titled Dock Like an Egyptian. Which looks really interesting.
Great talk title.
A great talk title, but the actual content looks very interesting as well. She'll also be running the BSD certification group. We'll have the BSDA exam available there. If you want to take that, you need to register ahead of time and sign up on their website and everything.
I think that's what, like $75.
I think, $75 to take it at the conference, and you can be paid by PayPal or credit card. There's no other certification you can get that's that cheap or that good.
Yeah, that's right. And
and it covers all the BSDs, NetBSD, OpenBSD, FreeBSD, etc. I've taken it.
Nice. Well, of course, so along with the FreeBSD having a booth there, along with the FreeBSD Foundation, it looks like NetBSD is going to be there, OpenBSD, and pfSense. So you kind of got your pick, and you can meet some different folks from all those different projects. So definitely a good conference to get to. So try going down there. I see we have a link here to something on Phosphorus where Larry wrote about it, and he was talking about maybe arranging a BOF there. Cool. So he's asking people to ping him on Twitter. So if that's something you're going to go to and you're interested in it, maybe let him know on Twitter, and you guys can get together and do a little FreeBSD session. Okay, so the next beastie bit here we want to bring along. We had mentioned we'd seen kind of the start of this a while back, but Xen support being enabled in OpenBSD current. So I know we mentioned when the patches started going in, but it looks like it's been flipped now. So
on by default.
Oh, yeah.
For AMD 64 anyway. I love the little quote at the end here, though. There are still these are still early days, and no doubt a few bugs to find. But if you have any Xen architecture, time to take the SS Puffy on a shakedown cruise. That's
right. So they're asking you to send bug any issues that you find with it as well. So definitely let them know. But yeah, that's pretty cool to see that has landed. So congrats, guys, for getting that.
And in the comments, somebody asked if that means you can run OpenBSD on Amazon's AWS, and the answer is yes, you can.
Oh, somebody's asking what a BOF is. It's a birds of a feather session where you get together to discuss a common shared topic or goal.
Yeah, so a regular talk is one person talking and everybody listens and maybe they ask questions at the end. Whereas a BOF is kind of almost more of a round table. Basically, everybody sits in a circle or some other shape and just kind of goes around, talks about what they when we did a ZFS one at VBSD Con, everybody kind of sat in a circle and we asked each person just quickly mention what they use ZFS for, and we people ask questions they had. It's like, well, I have ZFS set up this way and I have this problem. Does anybody else have this? Or what's the best way to do this? And you basically just similar to a user group meeting, but kind of hyper focused into an hour or less at a conference. They're really fun.
Okay,
they're really nice because you go to it and you don't have to speak much, but you can, kind of thing.
But you can, and you guys can discuss and like, hey, I've been trying to do this. How do you do that? And maybe you can do debugging or support there on the fly. Just get together and talk all things.
Great for the users to talk, but also uses to help other users, but also it helps the developers get an idea of where people want more features.
That's right. Okay, well, that's it for Beastie Bits this week. So we've got some feedback to get to. It
Yes.
looks like Matt's going to be the first
Sure, I'll
one
read
up
this one
today.
if you want.
Yeah.
So Matt
Go
asked
for it.
about the size of the ZIL, or I think what he actually means is a slog, which is the separate intent log. Every ZFS pool has a ZIL, or ZFS intent log, and it's normally just a regular part of the pool. But if you get a separate dedicated SSD for it or something, then it's called a slog, or separate intent log. But anyway, so he says he really enjoyed the ZFS episode a few weeks ago, and I've been working on configuring FreeNAS server, and I've got a pair of SSDs which I intend to use as a mirrored S-log for my ZFS pool. I've heard that's a good idea to over-provision or under-provision the SSDs to improve wear leveling, and also that the S-log doesn't need to be very big. Yeah, normally your ZIL or the S-log devices probably don't need to be bigger than 16 gigabytes or even less than that, because basically it's only holding stuff until it can be flushed to the disk. So, hundreds of gigs just doesn't make any sense. It never gets used. So you can partition the disk and, keep, the first 16 gigs of the SSD for the ZIL, and then not use the rest of the SSD. And then obviously the SSD will last longer because it can wear level all the parts that are unused, or use the rest of it as your L2 ARC. Although then, if your SSD is saturated performance-wise, then you're not necessarily getting the same speed as you would if you had the SSD dedicated to one or the other. But anyway, it says, can you share what would be appropriate size for S-log for a 12 terabyte pool that will be used primarily as an NFS file share? I may carve out some of that for other purposes, perhaps a small CIFS file share, which would be handy to have, and so on. So yes, especially with NFS, a slog can help a lot because NFS is mostly synchronous. And so, when the file is closed on the remote machine, you want to make sure that the data is actually secure on the NFS server before it goes away, because, it's not available on the other side anymore. But I don't think you'll ever need more than 16 gigs of S-log. I don't know. I don't have much experience with S-logs. I don't normally do them because all of my ZFS is like bulk storage of giant video files. And so it's not transaction heavy.
It's not as useful.
Files almost never get overwritten. They just get sent to me and then just sit there. But yeah, you don't need that much space. And so you can probably use the rest for L2 ARC or something. He says, the more important question, one that I didn't find an answer to from reading the documentation or by Googling, is how can I set up a smaller partition on the mirrored SSDs being used as a S-log? Whenever I attempt to create a pool on FreeNAS, it allows me to create a mirrored ZIL, but it takes the entire space of the disk. When I click manual setup instead of the volume manager wizard, all I get are a set of radio buttons under ZFS extra to create a log device. Doesn't sound optimal from all that I understand about wear leveling. This might not provide the best longevity for the drive. So the physical drive itself doesn't actually know what's included in a partition and what's unused. It just knows what blocks have ever actually been written to. And so it probably isn't a big deal to use the whole drive, other than the case where you might want to actually use it. Otherwise, yeah, the FreeNAS GUI really isn't designed for that kind of advanced configuration. You would have to manually create the partitions and attach it to the pool yourself. So you'd have to look at the the FreeBSD handbook and see how you attach a log device and how you can use gpart to create a partition of a certain size. But in the end, the wear leveling is based on what's actually written to blocks and how busy the different flashes are. And so, the wear leveling basically has to do with how much data you keep on the drive versus how much space is allocated to a partition, because the drive doesn't actually know anything about partitions. So it just knows how much data is written to it, and then it knows the data is not used anymore when it's trimmed. So on a ZIL or S-log device, it's really not an issue because the data never stays there very long. It always gets erased as soon as it's copied to the stable storage of the disks. And so it's not really going to affect your wear leveling either way. He says he really thinks that FreeNAS is the best approach, and I agree with him. And just, he was running into the limitations of the GUI, but it's there because you probably don't want to do anything more advanced anyway. And it says, lastly, he had an unrelated question. Can you recommend any good resource for learning to do shell scripting, preferably with plain Bourne shell as opposed to Bash, as I am sometime I endeavor to learn more about. Listening to the interview with Trent Thompson and the IOHive creator was really encouraging and convinced me that it's a good way to learn this stuff.
I never had a book on shell, honestly. I don't think I've ever read one. I just did it.
Yeah.
Like a lot of Googling.
Yeah.
That's my handbook.
The Googling requires a bit of work to make sure you don't get Bash examples, but yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, 9 times out of 10, it would be, even if it was Bash, it was close enough that it pointed me in the right direction, and then I could figure it out. But yeah, or just the nice thing about shell is it's pretty readable too. If you find a script like IOHive, you can kind of start at the beginning, work your way through, and it mostly will start making sense, even if some of the syntax doesn't at first.
The two of the main shell gurus in FreeBSD have been threatening to write a book for a while, but they haven't actually done it.
Well, one of these days.
Crack the whip.
Okay, so who we got next here? Looks like Drin wrote in asking about IPsec. He said, gentlemen, your show has inspired me to install FreeBSD 10.2 on my Lenovo T520 laptop. I initially tried PCBSD, but decided to try out a minimalist install of vanilla FreeBSD as it seemed like a better learning opportunity. I've managed to get X and XFCE running so far, and everything's been going well. No issues with drivers, suspend resumes working. But he said, however, I've hit a wall trying to get IPsec client working. I've installed the Shrusoft Ike software using PKG and was told by the post-install message that the generic kernel isn't compiled with IPsec support, which is true.
It was true until 11 at some point a couple of months ago, where George Neville Neal turned it on by default.
Okay.
Yeah.
But that's not.
But that won't.
Yeah, he's still running 10.2.
Won't apply to 10.2. Yep.
Yep. So for 11, that'll change. So if you're watching this later and 11.0 is out,
or you grab a PCBSD head snapshot.
Yep. Yes, that's right. You could do that too. He says, a quick check of the handbook confirmed this. I followed the instructions in the handbook to configure and install a custom kernel, but I'm not sure if I need to add anything to rc.conf to get it operational, or if that's only required when setting up a VPN server. I'm trying to connect to a WatchGuard device and have a configuration file which TrueSoft client should be able to import, but this whole endeavor has turned out somewhat more complex than I anticipated. Do you know of any tutorials that I can follow to get this working, or perhaps some other VPN client software that supports the IPsec tunnels? Thanks, and keep up the great work.
If it's just plain IPsec and there's nothing special about it, it should be pretty easy to do. I think the FreeBSD handbook has an example of a plain IPsec thing, but I don't know much about IPsec.
It shows how to install the client from ports, IPsec tools under security. And then it walks through all the configuration in the handbook. I'm looking at it right now.
Cool. And I don't know why I've never used the Shrusoft one, so I don't know what problem you might be running into with it. But yeah, once you have IPsec enabled in the kernel, it should be fairly straightforward. There's nothing special you have to do to turn it on. It's just a matter of having your client then use it.
Yeah, I'm looking here. It looks like they show examples using Raccoon and all kinds of stuff.
Biggest thing is just, uname -a and make sure it says that it's actually running your new custom kernel rather than the plain generic, and you're good to go.
Okay. Great. Well, thanks for writing in. We appreciate it. So next up we have John, who writes in, which actually this is kind of timely, ZFS plus UEFI. He said, I've been using ZFS on my FreeNAS server with lots of success, and hearing about how well it's worked for you guys on the desktop led me to try installing FreeBSD with ZFS en route. When I started the automatic ZFS install, I was welcomed with a message telling me that UEFI support was not supported and that I needed to change to legacy CSM mode. Seeing as I'm dual booting other UEFI installs, I really don't want to turn off UEFI. Is there really no way in FreeBSD to install FreeBSD using UEFI en route? I don't really want a UFS partition, as I want to be able to snapshot my entire system. Well, who doesn't? He said, I was really excited to try FreeBSD on the desktop, and one of the things I was really excited about was the ZFS support, so I'm surprised to see that this wasn't doable. I'm sure there's some way to do it that I'm missing, and if I need to do a manual ZFS root install, I'm happy to do it, but I haven't been able to find the information on how it's done. What have you done for your installs, or are you just using legacy mode? Thanks for the great show, John.
So it wasn't impossible last week. It was impossible last week. This week it's possible.
Right. Yeah, you had really good timing on that.
Of course, that's not in a release yet, and so you take a little bit longer before it gets there.
Has that been put in the installer already?
I've written the patch for the installer, and it's under review, and that should go in soon. Currently, the EFI ZFS code hasn't been backported to 10 yet.
I was going to say, you could use the PCBSD text installer, which will do UEFI. We've been pulling in the patches ahead of time, so you could grab our current image for January, and we have a text installer. It'll be TrueOS is what it's called, but it's just basically FreeBSD. It just has those patches that just went in like this week.
So yeah, you can grab those to have that right now, or if you grab PCBSD, even 10.2, it supports UEFI via Grub, right? Yeah.
Yes.
So you can do either of those for now, and in FreeBSD 11, it will all just work nicely. I don't know about 10.3. We're very close to the deadline there,
gray area.
and it's a pretty new feature, and it was looking pretty good, but then with the possible regression on UFS, that's making people a little more skittish about possibly putting it back into 10. So hopefully next week we know for sure if it's going to be in 10.3 or not. And then the hard freeze is on the 29th. So just after the Friday after next week's episode will be.
Man, I need to roll a PCBSD 10.3 image now, don't I? I've been so focused on 11.0. We're not backporting any of our stuff from 11, those changes into 10.3. So you at least have the next cycle will be stable still before we break your system. Okay. Well, let's see. So Jake now writes in. He says, I admit I have not called iXsystems yet. Well, okay. There's your problem right there. We'll just stop the conversation. You can go call them and take care of it. But, okay. For real, though. He says, I'm wondering if ZFS has a solution that would be comparable to Compellent or, say, EMC SAN offerings where they are HA clustered storage and fully redundant. To include that, they do firmware upgrades while serving I/O operations. Thanks, Jake.
Well, it depends what you mean by clustering. So if you just mean high availability, then IX makes a product called the TrueNAS, where basically you have two separate computers that are the controllers. They're like one U, and then they connect to a shared set of shelves of disks. And so one of them can go down for a firmware update or any other reason, and everything is served seamlessly off the other one, and you get high availability from your set of disks. However, that's not the same as clustering, where you would have 10 giant storage things and any two of them can go down and they all the files are still there, kind of thing. Where with clustering, basically you're getting more space than you can fit in any one computer by doing this. ZFS doesn't really have a solution for that yet. There's some like back of a napkin ideas for a system that maybe someday we'll have, but that's not really something ZFS has. But IX is perfectly capable of building you a dual-headed redundant, like HA ZFS machine with, a petabyte of storage or more.
Yeah, you use TrueNAS because they have, failover.
Yeah, it's got all the failover and high availability, so it'll stay up. It's just not the same as a cluster solution where you're actually combining a whole bunch of separate machines in order to be able to have N+2 or something like that. Although usually with clustering, the idea is not about having redundant access to one set of storage, but to combine a whole bunch of different sets of storage into one bigger virtual pool. And that's not something ZFS can do yet. But yes, IX can definitely build you a high availability solution that will stay up during firmware upgrades.
Great. Okay. Well, definitely just get on the phone, call IX, make that
Ask
happen.
them. They will have a better answer.
Yes, they will tell you exactly what.
And unlike other vendors, they will actually tell you about limitations if there are any. Of it can handle this, but it can't handle this, and you can decide if that's good enough or not.
That's right. So of course, tell them you heard about it here when you talk to them.
Yes, they will help you more.
Yes, they'll be like, "Oh, we love BSDNow, folks." So yeah, that's a good deal. Okay, so it looks like lastly we have Philip. You want to read this one, Alan?
So Philip has a media server he'd like to ask us some questions about. He says, just want to let you guys know that I'm really enjoying your show and going through the back catalog of episodes while I work. I have a Windows/Linux user from about 1996 to 2004 when I made the switch to Linux full time. I'm now an OS X convert and loving it, but still run to home CentOS servers and about 4 CentOS VPSs for various reasons. Your show convinced me to try BSD again. My first time with FreeBSD ended with a terminal screen where I said, "Where the hell is X?" I played distro roulette for many years, finally settling on Arch before jumping to OS X. At least I got closer to BSD. Now I feel it's time to switch my servers over to BSD. Your podcast has convinced me to try FreeNAS for my media server, and everything went well until I tried to download off the box, and I could only get about 10 megabits per second speeds. On CentOS, I was getting the full 1 gig. My upload was 1 gigabit though. But I wasn't able to get any help from the forums because I wasn't using an Intel NIC, and my testing computer was only using Wi-Fi. Well, obviously, you can't get a full gigabit over Wi-Fi. So my first introduction to seeking help was not a very good one. After the 100th comment that it's your router or your NIC, I gave up and went back to CentOS, where I live with 1 gigabit glory. He doesn't mention what protocol he's trying to pull files over. I'm guessing Samba?
No, he doesn't. Maybe.
I don't know.
For a media server, I would guess it's that, unless he's... Yeah.
I've heard other people complain. I get a gigabit out of my FreeBSD machine, but I've had other FreeBSD people not believe me until I showed them screenshots. But I'm undaunted and recently purchased a Dell R410 Xeon server to dive headfirst again into BSD, not FreeNAS this time. I'm sorry that the FreeNAS forums weren't very nice to you. There's so many things that it could be. It's very difficult to tell just with your short description of the problem. But knowing specifically which protocol it was, the other thing is obviously using something like iPerf to check the performance of the network without any file sharing protocol involved and make sure that you're getting what you expect. And if not, making the tweaks necessary there. You didn't mention what kind of NIC it was. Realtek is kind of notoriously buggy, but it's hard to say. So anyway, he says, now I need to figure out which BSD is better for a media server, and if I should wait for Skylake support or just build a Broadwell-based mini ITX board so I can fully immerse myself in BSD before switching my media server over. It depends, as far as Broadwell and Skylake goes, if it's going to be a media server without a monitor attached, then you don't have to worry about the graphics card support. Just go with whatever and do it. FreeNAS has a couple of advantages for media server stuff, but you can install Plex on vanilla FreeBSD. It's just FreeNAS makes it slightly easier, but when it's slightly easier, you don't necessarily learn as much about it. So my home file server is vanilla FreeBSD because it's also where I do all my development. Because
Ditto.
Until more recently, it was I didn't have that many FreeBSD boxes in the house. Now I have a whole rack of them, but they're all busy doing work things. So it's nice to have a machine to experiment on.
I have a FreeNAS, and it's for all my backups, of the FreeBSD boxes, right? So that's my cold storage in effect.
So thanks for writing in, and sorry, that's like the second or third time I've heard the FreeNAS forums are being nasty to people, but
Wild West, man.
it's the internet. Sadly, we can't control all the
things
people.
happen on the internet. Okay, well, as we wrap up the show, folks, first of all, thank you so much for listening. We appreciate it, especially when we have longer shows like today, especially for all those who watched live. I mean, an extra special treat for you guys because you basically got 3 interviews today, which how cool is that? But anyway, as we wrap it up, of course, we want to remind everyone, send any comments if you have any ideas or topics for the shows. If you find stories out on the internet, there's a lot of things that we just don't see. I mean, we're only a few people over here. So if there's a story you find that you think we haven't mentioned or we should mention, do send that in to feedback@bsdnow.tv, and we'll try and get that in on a future episode. So please send it in. Duplicates are fine. We'll sift through them all and make sure we got all the good stuff. But send it all into feedback@bsdnow.tv. Don't leave a comment on YouTube or anywhere else. We may not see it. But send your stuff in there if you want to be sure that we got it. Of course, if you'd like to come on the show for an interview, we always love taking you folks for interviews as well. And hearing your story and how BSD's changed your life, changed how you guys work or what you do at the office. All that stuff's good. So send it on in. So again, thanks folks for being here. We'll be back same time next week.